Karl Marx never fired a gun, he never commanded an army, he never held political office. He spent most of his adult life in poverty, writing in libraries, surviving on loans from friends. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral. He was a failed academic, an expelled journalist, a permanent exile. By any conventional measure, he was a failure. Yet his ideas would reshape the world more dramatically than any conqueror or king. Within decades of his death, movements claiming his name had millions of followers. By the mid-20th century, 1/3 of humanity lived under governments proclaiming themselves Marxist. Revolutions were fought in his name. Nations were built on his theories. Empires rose and fell claiming to implement his vision. No other philosopher's ideas have been connected to such devastation. This is the dark legacy that haunts Marx's name. His defenders argue these catastrophes betrayed his vision rather than fulfilled it. His critics insist they revealed inevitable consequences of his theories. The debate has never been resolved. Yet Marx cannot be dismissed or ignored. The communist experiments may have failed, but capitalism's problems persist. Extreme inequality concentrates wealth in fewer hands than ever. Financial crises shake the global economy repeatedly. Work becomes more precarious and alienating. Environmental destruction accelerates toward irreversible catastrophe. Technology displaces workers while profits soar. The contradictions Marx identified have not disappeared but intensified. This makes Marx perhaps the most relevant and dangerous thinker for our time. Relevant because his analysis of capitalism explains contemporary crises better than alternatives. Dangerous because attempts to implement his vision produced unprecedented horrors. Understanding Marx means confronting this paradox. How can ideas that explain so much have inspired so much destruction? Was Marx a prophet who foresaw capitalism's self-destructive contradictions? Or an architect of totalitarian nightmares? A liberator who showed workers their power? Or an ideologue whose theories justified mass murder? The truth is more complex than either admirers or critics acknowledge. Marx developed a comprehensive analysis of how capitalism works, why it produces inequality and crisis, and why it must eventually be replaced. He argued that capitalism's contradictions would intensify until workers overthrew the system and established a classless society. Whether he was right about capitalism's dynamics, wrong about revolution's consequences, or misunderstood entirely by those claiming his legacy, are questions with stakes beyond academic interest. Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in the small Prussian city of Trier, located in what is now Western Germany. His father, Herschel Marx, was a lawyer who had converted from Judaism to Lutheran Christianity to continue practicing law under Prussian restrictions. The family was comfortable, educated, and part of the growing middle class that characterized early 19th century Europe. Young Karl grew up in a household that valued learning and intellectual discussion, surrounded by books and ideas that would shape his future path. Trier itself was a city caught between worlds. Ancient Roman ruins stood alongside medieval buildings, while new industrial developments began transforming the landscape. This mix of old and new, tradition and progress, would become a recurring theme in Marx's analysis of society. The region had recently been incorporated into Prussia after the Napoleonic Wars, and the political tensions of post-revolutionary Europe were palpable even in this provincial town. Marx attended the local gymnasium, where he proved to be a capable student with particular strength in languages and literature. In 1835, at 17, he left Trier to study at the University of Bonn. His father hoped he would pursue law, following in the family tradition. Instead, Marx spent much of his first year drinking, writing romantic poetry, and accumulating debts. He joined a drinking club, got into at least one duel, and was briefly imprisoned for drunkenness and disturbing the peace. His worried father transferred him to the more serious University of Berlin after just 1 year. Berlin transformed Marx. The city was the intellectual capital of Prussia, and the university was dominated by the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who had died just 5 years before Marx arrived. Hegel's complex system of thought, which saw history as the progressive unfolding of human freedom through dialectical conflict, captivated the young student. Marx abandoned his poetry and threw himself into philosophy, often studying through the night until he made himself ill from exhaustion. He joined a group called the Young Hegelians, radical intellectuals who used Hegel's methods to criticize religion and politics. While Hegel himself had been relatively conservative, these young thinkers pushed his ideas in revolutionary directions. Marx completed his doctoral dissertation on ancient Greek philosophy in 1841, comparing the materialist philosophies of Democritus and Epicurus. The work already showed hints of his later thinking, particularly his interest in how humans create their own reality through material activity. With his doctorate complete, Marx hoped for an academic career, but his radical associations made this impossible in conservative Prussia. Instead, he turned to journalism, becoming editor of a liberal newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne in 1842. Here Marx encountered the practical problems of real people for the first time. He wrote articles defending the rights of poor peasants who gathered fallen wood from forests, an activity that new laws had criminalized. These concrete issues of property, law, and class interest forced Marx to move beyond abstract philosophy toward understanding the economic foundations of society. The Prussian government shut down the newspaper in 1843 for its critical stance. That same year, Marx married Jenny von Westphalen, an educated woman from an aristocratic family who had been promised to him since their youth in Trier. Jenny would remain his lifelong partner through poverty, exile, and illness. Shortly after their marriage, the couple moved to Paris, then the center of revolutionary thinking in Europe. Paris in the 1840s was electric with radical ideas. Socialists, communists, anarchists, and republicans debated in cafes and published in journals. Marx met Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Mikhail Bakunin, and most importantly, Friedrich Engels, a young German businessman's son who was managing his family's cotton factory in Manchester, while secretly writing about the horrific conditions of English workers. Engels and Marx discovered they shared nearly identical views on philosophy, economics, and revolution. They began a collaboration that would last Marx's entire life. In Paris, Marx also began his serious study of political economy, reading Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and the French socialists. He started developing his critique of capitalism, writing manuscripts that combined Hegelian philosophy with economic analysis. These early works introduced concepts like alienation and the critique of private property that would remain central to his thinking. The Prussian government pressured France to expel Marx in 1845, and he moved to Brussels. There, he and Engels wrote The German Ideology, a massive manuscript that laid out their materialist conception of history. They also joined the Communist League, a small group of radical workers and intellectuals. In 1848, the League commissioned them to write a statement of principles. The result was the Communist Manifesto, published in February 1848, just as revolutions broke out across Europe. The revolutionary wave of 1848 seemed to confirm Marx's theories. Workers and radicals rose up in France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and beyond, demanding democratic reforms and economic justice. Marx rushed to Cologne to participate, editing a new radical newspaper. But the revolutions failed. By 1849, conservative forces had regained control across the continent. Marx was expelled from Germany, briefly returned to Paris, and then fled to London, where he would spend the rest of his life. London in the 1850s was the capital of the world's first industrial nation, and Marx studied it intensely. He spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, filling notebook after notebook with excerpts and analysis of economic texts, factory reports, and government documents. His family lived in poverty in cramped apartments in Soho. 3 of his children died young. Jenny took in sewing work. Engels, now back managing his family's business in Manchester, sent regular financial support that kept the family afloat. Despite the hardship, Marx continued working on his critique of political economy. He wrote articles on current events for American newspapers to earn money. He participated in the International Workingmen's Association, the First International, trying to unite workers' movements across national boundaries. And he labored on his masterwork, Capital, which analyzed the capitalist system in exhaustive detail. The first volume of Capital appeared in 1867. It received little immediate attention, but gradually found readers among workers and intellectuals. Marx continued working on additional volumes, but his health was declining. He suffered from liver problems, headaches, insomnia, and painful boils. Jenny died in 1881 after a long illness. Marx's beloved eldest daughter Jenny died the following year. Marx himself died on March 14, 1883, sitting in his armchair. Only 11 people attended his funeral. He left behind an enormous body of work, most of it unpublished. Engels spent years editing Marx's manuscripts into the second and third volumes of Capital. The influence of Marx's ideas, however, would grow beyond anything he could have imagined. Within decades, revolutionary movements around the world claimed him as their inspiration. Governments ruling over billions of people would be established in his name. His analysis of capitalism would shape academic disciplines and political debates into the 21st century. The poor radical exile who died in London became one of the most influential thinkers in human history. The Young Rebel, Early Writings and Influences. Before Marx became the systematic analyst of capitalism, he was a young philosopher struggling to understand the relationship between ideas and reality. His early writings, produced mostly in the 1840s before he left for London, reveal a thinker wrestling with fundamental questions about human nature, freedom, and social organization. These texts are less systematic than his later work, but often more accessible, dealing with themes that remain immediately recognizable to modern readers. The dominant intellectual influence on young Marx was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher who had died in 1831. Hegel's philosophy was notoriously difficult, expressed in dense, abstract language. But his central idea was powerful. History was not random, but followed a rational pattern, moving through contradictions toward increasing human freedom and self-awareness. Hegel called this pattern the dialectic. A thesis produces its opposite, an antithesis, and from their conflict emerges a synthesis that preserves elements of both while moving to a higher level. For Hegel, this dialectical process occurred primarily in the realm of ideas and consciousness. History was the story of the absolute spirit coming to know itself through human thought and culture. Material reality was ultimately secondary to this spiritual development. The real was rational, and the rational was real. This meant that whatever existed had some rational necessity to it, which conservative interpreters used to justify the existing Prussian state. The young Hegelians, Marx's philosophical circle in Berlin, rejected this conservative interpretation. They focused on Hegel's dialectical method rather than his system. Ludwig Feuerbach, a key influence on the young Marx, made a crucial move. He turned Hegel upside down. In his work, The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach argued that religion did not reveal divine truth, but rather showed human nature projected onto an imaginary God. Humans created God in their own image, not the other way around. Theology was actually anthropology in disguise. This critique resonated deeply with Marx, but he soon concluded that Feuerbach did not go far enough. Feuerbach replaced religious idealism with a materialist philosophy focused on human sensuous nature, but his materialism was abstract and ahistorical. It described a generic human essence rather than real people living in specific social conditions. In his Theses on Feuerbach, written in 1845, Marx formulated a new kind of materialism. The famous 11th thesis declared that philosophers had only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point was to change it. Marx's materialism was practical and historical. Humans were not defined by abstract essences, but by what they did, specifically by how they produced their means of subsistence. Labor, the transformation of nature to meet human needs, was the fundamental human activity. Through labor, humans not only changed nature, but changed themselves, developing new capacities and needs. History was the record of changing modes of production and the social relationships they created. This insight emerged clearly in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, written in Paris. Here, Marx introduced the concept of alienation, which would remain central to his critique of capitalism. Under capitalism, workers were alienated from the products of their labor, which belonged to the capitalist rather than the producer. They were alienated from the act of production itself, which became mere drudgery rather than creative activity. They were alienated from their own human potential, reduced to mere instruments of production. And they were alienated from other people, who appeared as competitors or exploiters rather than fellow human beings. This alienation was not just a psychological condition, but rooted in real economic relationships. Private property was both cause and effect of alienated labor. The solution required not just changes in consciousness, but transformation of the actual economic structure of society. This was why Marx broke with the young Hegelians, who thought criticism and education could change society. Ideas alone could not overthrow material conditions. In the German ideology, written with Engels in 1845-46, Marx developed this materialist conception of history more systematically. Consciousness did not determine life. Life determined consciousness. What people thought depended on their material conditions and social position. The ruling ideas of any age were the ideas of the ruling class, because those who controlled material production also controlled mental production. Ideology functioned to make the existing order seem natural and inevitable. But material conditions were not static. They developed through contradictions internal to each mode of production. The forces of production, the technical means by which humans produced, came into conflict with the relations of production, the social relationships governing who controlled production and distribution. When the contradiction became acute, revolutionary transformation became possible. The rising class, representing more advanced productive forces, would overthrow the existing ruling class. This framework let Marx see history as a succession of modes of production: primitive communism, ancient slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Each contained the seeds of its successor. Capitalism was revolutionary compared to feudalism, vastly increasing productive power and creating a world market. But it also created its own gravedigger, the proletariat, the class of wage workers who own nothing but their labor power. The proletariat's position was unique in history. Previous revolutionary classes, like the bourgeoisie that overthrew feudalism, simply replaced one form of class rule with another. But the proletariat could not liberate itself without abolishing class itself, since it was defined by having no property. Its revolution would be universal, creating a society without exploitation or class divisions. These ideas reached their most accessible expression in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. The text opened with a historical sweep describing how capitalism had transformed the world. It analyzed the class structure of capitalist society. It criticized other varieties of socialism as inadequate, and it called for working-class revolution and the establishment of communism. The manifesto's rhetoric was powerful and direct. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. Workers of all countries unite. These phrases entered political discourse worldwide, mobilizing millions. But the young Marx was not just producing political propaganda. He was synthesizing multiple intellectual traditions: German philosophy, French socialism, and British political economy. From Hegel, he took the dialectical method and the vision of history as rational development. From Feuerbach, he took philosophical materialism. From French socialists like Proudhon and Louis Blanc, he took the critique of property and the vision of alternative economic arrangements. From British economists like Ricardo, he took the labor theory of value and the analysis of capitalist dynamics. Yet Marx transformed everything he borrowed. His materialism was historical and practical, not mechanical. His dialectics operated in real social contradictions, not abstract logic. His socialism was grounded in economic analysis, not moral appeals. And his vision of revolution came from understanding capitalism's internal logic, not just moral outrage at its injustices. The early writings showed a thinker of extraordinary range and ambition, attempting nothing less than a total critique of existing society and a scientific basis for revolutionary transformation. The concepts developed in these years would structure everything Marx wrote afterward. When he turned to the detailed analysis of political economy and capital, he brought this philosophical foundation with him. The abstract discussions of alienation became concrete analysis of commodity fetishism. The materialist conception of history became the framework for understanding capitalism's laws of motion. The young philosopher became the mature economist, but the revolutionary vision remained constant. Alienation. When work steals your soul. Work is supposed to be how humans express themselves, develop their abilities, and create the world around them. For most people, though, work feels like the opposite. Monotonous, exhausting, something to endure rather than enjoy. Marx's concept of alienation explains why. Under capitalism, the very activity that should be most fulfilling becomes a source of misery and self-estrangement. Alienation was not Marx's invention. Hegel had used the term to describe how consciousness becomes alienated from itself, existing in external forms before returning to self-awareness. Feuerbach applied it to religion, arguing that humans alienate their own powers by projecting them onto an imaginary god. Marx took the concept and grounded it in economic reality. Alienation was not primarily a philosophical or religious problem, but a condition created by specific social relationships of production. Marx identified 4 dimensions of alienation under capitalism. First, workers are alienated from the products of their labor. What they produce does not belong to them, but to the capitalist who owns the means of production. The worker might spend years building cars or sewing clothes, yet the fruits of this labor immediately become someone else's property. The more the worker produces, the more wealth accumulates in alien hands. Production enriches the capitalist while potentially impoverishing the worker, creating a strange inversion where the creator is dominated by the creation. This alienation intensifies because products enter the market as commodities, things produced for exchange rather than direct use. The worker has no say in what is produced, how it is produced, or what happens to it afterward. A furniture maker under capitalism does not craft chairs for people who need them, but produces commodities for whoever can pay. The connection between producer and product is severed. The worker's labor congeals into objects that exist independently and often in opposition to their creator. Second, workers are alienated from the act of production itself. Labor under capitalism is not voluntary self-expression, but coerced activity. Workers sell their labor power because they must in order to survive. They do not work to fulfill themselves, but to earn wages. The activity of production, which should be the primary manifestation of human creativity, becomes merely a means to an end, getting paid. Work is not life, but a sacrifice of life. This transforms the experience of labor. Instead of engaging creatively with materials and processes, workers follow instructions and repeat tasks designed by others. The production process is broken into simple, repetitive operations. Skill and autonomy diminish. Factory workers tend machines according to rhythms determined by capital's need for efficiency. Office workers process information according to standardized procedures. The work itself becomes alien, external, not belonging to the worker's essential being. Marx noted that workers feel most themselves outside of work. During labor, they feel alienated from themselves. After work, they feel at home. This is a terrible reversal. The specifically human activity of conscious productive labor becomes merely animal existence focused on eating, drinking, and reproducing. Meanwhile, activities that should be secondary become the only moments of genuine human feeling. The worker only feels freely active in their animal functions, while in their human functions they are reduced to animals. Third, workers are alienated from their species being, Marx's term for the distinctive human nature expressed through conscious productive activity. Humans are distinguished from animals by their ability to produce universally, transforming nature according to conscious plans and aesthetic standards. A bird builds one kind of nest. Humans build in many styles, adapting to circumstances and artistic vision. Humans can produce even when free from physical need, creating art and culture. Capitalism reduces this universal productive capacity to mere survival. The worker produces not as an expression of human power, but only to maintain physical existence. Labor is forced labor, not free activity. Species being becomes merely a means to individual existence, rather than an end in itself. The vast productive potential of humanity is harnessed solely for capital accumulation, not human flourishing. Fourth, workers are alienated from other people. Capitalism sets humans against each other in competition. Workers compete for jobs, capitalists compete for profits. The social nature of production is obscured by private appropriation. Though production is increasingly collective, involving coordination of many workers, the fruits are privately owned. Though workers depend on each other, they experience each other as threats to their own employment and wages. The relationship between worker and capitalist is especially alienated. It appears as a voluntary contract between free individuals. But the power imbalance is enormous. The capitalist owns the means of production. The worker owns only labor power. One can wait, the other must eat. The contract is between unequals, though the law treats them as equals. The capitalist appears not as an exploiter but as a job provider, though the arrangement systematically transfers wealth from worker to owner. Alienation is not just subjective dissatisfaction. It is an objective condition created by the structure of capitalist production. Private property in the means of production necessarily alienates workers from products, activity, species being, and each other. As long as some people own factories, land, and resources, while others must sell their labor to survive, alienation persists regardless of how workers feel about it. Modern developments have intensified certain forms of alienation while superficially reducing others. Technology has eliminated much dangerous and exhausting manual labor. Many workers have more autonomy than 19th century factory hands. Yet alienation persists in new forms. Digital labor is monitored with unprecedented precision. Algorithms dictate work rhythms and evaluate performance. The gig economy fragments work into isolated tasks stripped of social connection and security. White-collar workers, once thought exempt from alienation, experience it acutely. Corporate jobs often involve meaningless tasks, endless meetings, and production of nothing tangible. The products are abstractions. Financial instruments, marketing strategies, data analysis. The connection between effort and outcome dissolves entirely. Workers cannot point to anything they have made, only to time sold and tasks completed. Service workers face distinctive alienation. They must not only perform labor, but also perform emotional labor, displaying prescribed feelings regardless of actual emotions. Retail workers must smile and be friendly. Call center workers must follow scripts while sounding authentic. The boundary between person and role collapses. Not just labor power, but personality itself becomes commodified. Marx saw alienation as neither natural nor eternal, but historical, and therefore potentially transcendable. It arose with specific property relationships and could be overcome by transforming those relationships. Communism, in Marx's vision, would mean the positive transcendence of alienation. When the means of production became socially owned and production was organized to meet human needs rather than accumulate capital, labor could become genuine self-expression. Work would no longer be opposed to life, but would become life's prime want. Critics argue this vision is utopian, that some degree of alienation is inevitable in any complex society requiring division of labor and coordination. Others contend that alienation is a necessary cost of productivity and material abundance. But Marx's analysis retains power because it captures a real experience. Most people sense that work could be different, more fulfilling, more connected to genuine human needs and capacities. The concept of alienation gives language to this inchoate feeling and suggests that the problem is not personal failure but social structure. The solution requires not individual adjustment but collective transformation of economic relationships. Historical materialism, the engine of history. Most people think ideas drive history. Great thinkers develop new philosophies. Inventors create new technologies. Religious prophets inspire spiritual movements. And political leaders implement new systems. Marx argued the opposite. Ideas do not fall from the sky or emerge from pure reason. They arise from material conditions, from the practical activity of producing and reproducing life. To understand history, you must look not primarily at what people thought, but at how they produced their material existence. This approach, which Marx called historical materialism, or the materialist conception of history, represented a revolution in understanding human society. Previous historians focused on kings and battles, great men and their ideas. Philosophers treated history as the unfolding of absolute spirit or providence. Marx insisted that history was made by real people engaged in practical activity, and that the foundation of all historical development was the mode of production. The mode of production consists of two elements. First, the forces of production, the tools, technologies, natural resources, and human knowledge and skills used to produce goods. These include everything from stone axes to computer systems, from agricultural techniques to scientific knowledge. Second, the relations of production, the social relationships that govern who controls production and how the products are distributed. These include property rights, class structures, and legal systems. Human history, for Marx, is the history of successive modes of production, each characterized by specific forces and relations of production. Primitive communism featured simple tools and collective ownership. Ancient societies developed more complex technologies but based production on slave labor. Feudalism organized production around land ownership and serf labor. Capitalism is characterized by industrial technology and wage labor. Each mode of production has its own internal logic and dynamics. The forces of production develop over time. People invent new tools, discover new techniques, accumulate knowledge. This development is not random but driven by necessity and human creativity. Humans must produce to survive, and they continually seek more effective ways to meet their needs. But at a certain point, the growing forces of production come into conflict with the existing relations of production. The social framework that once facilitated production becomes a fetter on further development. To take a simple example, feudal property relationships, where land was tied up in aristocratic estates and peasants were bound to the soil, eventually hindered the development of commercial agriculture and manufacturing. The new capitalist class, representing more advanced productive forces, needed different property relationships, mobile labor, liquid capital, freedom to buy and sell. This contradiction between forces and relations of production creates the basis for social revolution. The rising class, whose interests align with developing the forces of production, struggles against the established class, whose power rests on outdated relations of production. Revolution transforms the relations of production to match the level of productive forces. The French Revolution, for instance, was not primarily about ideas of liberty and equality, but about the bourgeoisie overthrowing feudal restrictions to enable capitalist development. This may sound like economic determinism, as if economic structures mechanically determine everything else. Marx's view was more nuanced. The economic base, the mode of production, does not directly determine the political and cultural superstructure. Rather, it sets limits and exerts pressures. It creates possibilities and constraints within which politics, law, art, and philosophy develop. The superstructure includes political institutions, legal systems, ideologies, religions, philosophies, and art. These arise on the foundation of the economic base and generally serve to reproduce it. The legal system protects property relationships. Political institutions manage conflicts within the ruling class and suppress challenges from below. Ideologies make the existing order seem natural, just, or divinely ordained. Religion can console the oppressed while teaching them to accept their place. Yet the relationship between base and superstructure is not one way. Political and legal structures, once established, can influence economic development. Ideas can mobilize people to action. Culture shapes how people understand and experience their material conditions. Marx recognized this interaction while maintaining that the economic base was ultimately primary. In the long run, economic structures shape politics and culture more than the reverse. This framework let Marx explain broad historical patterns. Why did slavery give way to feudalism and feudalism to capitalism? Not because people became morally enlightened, but because changing productive forces made new relations of production more viable and profitable. Why do certain ideas become dominant in particular eras? Not because they are truer, but because they correspond to the interests and experiences of the ruling class. Consider the idea of individual freedom. This concept became central in modern thought not because philosophers suddenly discovered it, but because capitalism required it. Feudalism was based on fixed social hierarchies and personal dependence. Capitalism requires mobile labor and impersonal market relationships. Workers must be free to sell their labor to any employer. Capitalists must be free to invest wherever profit beckons. The ideology of individual freedom reflects and justifies these material requirements. Or consider religion. Marx famously called religion the opium of the people. This is often misunderstood as simple atheist dismissal. Marx meant that religion functions as a painkiller in a painful social order. It provides comfort and meaning in conditions of suffering and powerlessness. But like opium, it treats symptoms rather than causes. It consoles without transforming the conditions that produce misery. The critique of religion is therefore the critique of the social conditions that make religion necessary. Historical materialism does not mean that individuals do not matter. People make history, but not in circumstances of their choosing. They inherit specific productive forces and social relations from previous generations. They act within these constraints, though their actions can eventually transform the structures themselves. Great individuals matter insofar as they express and advance historical possibilities latent in material conditions. Napoleon did not create the French Revolution, but gave it particular form. This view has profound implications. It means that fundamental social change requires changing material conditions, not just spreading better ideas. Education and moral persuasion have limited effect when economic structures remain unchanged. It also means that social forms are historical, not eternal. Capitalism is not human nature, but a specific mode of production with a beginning and, Marx argued, an eventual end. Critics raise several objections to historical materialism. First, it seems to reduce everything to economics, ignoring the autonomy of politics, culture, and individual agency. Second, it appears deterministic, as if history follows an inevitable script. Third, it seems to predict that revolution should occur where productive forces are most developed, yet actual revolutions happened in less developed countries like Russia and China. Marx and later Marxists responded that historical materialism is not economic reductionism, but recognition of economic primacy. Politics and culture have relative autonomy but develop within limits set by economic structures. It is not strict determinism but recognition that material conditions create possibilities and pressures, not guarantees. And revolution occurs not simply where forces of production are highest, but where contradictions between forces and relations are most acute, which can happen at different levels of development. Historical materialism remains influential because it offers a systematic way to connect economic structures to broader social forms. It directs attention to material conditions that other approaches ignore. It suggests that social problems cannot be solved by changing attitudes alone, but require institutional transformation. And it provides a framework for understanding how and why societies change over time, grounding historical explanation in observable human activity rather than abstract forces. Class struggle, the heart of society. The Communist Manifesto opens with a bold declaration. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in short, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. Marx was claiming that conflict between classes is the fundamental dynamic driving historical change. Class, for Marx, is not primarily about income or status, but about relationship to the means of production. In any society beyond primitive communism, some people own or control the means by which goods are produced while others do not. This creates distinct classes with opposing interests: slave owners and slaves, feudal lords and serfs, capitalists and workers. The specifics differ, but the basic pattern remains. One class exploits the labor of another. Exploitation has a precise technical meaning in Marx's analysis. It does not necessarily mean cruelty or even subjective oppression, though these often accompany it. Exploitation means that one class appropriates the surplus product created by another class's labor. Slaves produced more than their own subsistence, and masters took the excess. Serfs worked part of the week on their own plots and part on the lord's land. The lord appropriated the labor from those extra days. Wage workers produce value exceeding their wages, and capitalists take the surplus value as profit. This exploitation is the source of fundamental conflict. The exploiting class wants to maximize what it extracts. The exploited class wants to keep more of what it produces. These interests are irreconcilable within the existing system. The capitalist cannot pay workers the full value of their product and still make profit. Workers cannot receive the full value and remain workers within capitalism. The relationship is structurally antagonistic. Modern capitalism appears different from earlier class societies. Capitalists do not own workers as slaves were owned. Workers are legally free to change employers. The relationship seems voluntary, a contract between equals. But Marx argued this freedom is largely formal. Workers must sell their labor power to survive since they own no means of production. The alternative to wage labor is starvation, not genuine freedom. The contract is between unequals pretending to be equals. The capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, owns the factories, land, resources, and other means of production. This ownership is not just personal wealth, but control over society's productive capacity. Capitalists decide what gets produced, how it gets produced, where investments flow. These private decisions shape the entire economy and society. The bourgeoisie is not just wealthy, it rules. The working class, the proletariat, owns only its labor power, its capacity to work. Workers must sell this labor power to capitalists in exchange for wages. The wage covers the cost of reproducing labor power, keeping workers alive and able to work, and raising the next generation of workers. Everything beyond this goes to capital as profit, interest, or rent. Between these two main classes exist various intermediate groups. Small business owners, independent professionals, self-employed artisans occupy an ambiguous middle position. They own means of production but work themselves rather than living off exploited labor. Marx called this the petty bourgeoisie. Their economic position is unstable in capitalism, constantly threatened by concentration of capital. Some rise into the bourgeoisie, but most fall into the proletariat as competition crushes small operations. Peasants, still numerous in Marx's time, constituted another intermediate class. They owned small plots of land and worked them independently. But capitalism gradually proletarianizes peasants through debt, market pressures, and direct dispossession. Agricultural labor becomes wage labor. Independent producers become dependent workers. Managers and highly paid professionals represent a more modern intermediate layer. They do not own significant capital but receive substantial incomes and exercise authority over other workers. Their class position is contradictory, combining elements of capital and labor. They sell labor power but often identify with capital's interests due to income and workplace authority. Marx argued that capitalism tends toward class polarization. The middle classes shrink as capital concentrates and competition eliminates small producers. Society increasingly divides into two main camps: a small class of capitalists controlling enormous wealth and productive capacity, and a large class of propertyless workers dependent on wage labor. This simplification of class structure creates conditions for revolutionary transformation. Class struggle takes many forms. The most visible is direct conflict: strikes, protests, rebellions. Workers withhold labor to demand higher wages or better conditions. Capitalists respond with lockouts, strike breakers, and state repression. The history of capitalism is filled with these battles, from the Luddites smashing machines to modern labor movements. But class struggle also occurs in less obvious ways. Political conflicts over laws and policies reflect class interests. Tax policy, labor regulations, welfare spending, trade agreements benefit some classes at others' expense. Electoral politics becomes an arena of class struggle, though this is obscured by nationalism, religion, and other divisions. Cultural and ideological struggles matter too. The ruling class promotes ideas that justify its dominance, that the poor are lazy, that inequality reflects merit, that capitalism is natural and eternal. The working class develops counter-ideologies, solidarity, collective action, visions of alternative economic arrangements. Schools, media, churches become contested terrain where competing class worldviews struggle for dominance. Marx distinguished between a class in itself and a class for itself. A class in itself is an objective category defined by its relation to production. Workers are a class in itself simply by virtue of selling labor power, but they become a class for itself through developing consciousness of their shared interests and capacity for collective action. This requires organization, leadership, and experience of struggle. Class consciousness does not develop automatically. Workers may identify with employers, nation, religion, or craft rather than class. Competition between workers can override common interests. Ideology can make exploitation seem natural or just. The ruling class actively works to prevent working class unity through divisions based on race, ethnicity, nationality, skill, or employment status. Yet capitalism itself creates conditions for working class unity. It concentrates workers in factories and cities, facilitating communication and organization. It makes workers interdependent through socialized production. It generates common experiences of exploitation and periodic crises. Through struggle, workers can develop class consciousness and revolutionary potential. Marx argued that class struggle necessarily becomes political struggle. Economic conflicts with employers lead to demands for political change, universal suffrage, labor laws, restrictions on capital mobility. The working class must win political power to transform economic relations. Revolution is not just insurrection, but the working class constituting itself as the ruling class, using political dominance to transform property relations and eventually abolish class itself. The ultimate aim is not simply reversing positions, making workers the new exploiters. The proletariat's unique historical role is to abolish class as such. It can liberate itself only by eliminating the conditions that define it as a class: wage labor, private ownership of means of production, commodity production for profit. Proletarian revolution means ending exploitation and creating a classless society. Critics argue that class struggle is not the primary driver of history, pointing to conflicts based on nation, ethnicity, religion, or gender. Others note that workers in developed countries achieved significant gains without revolution, suggesting class conflict can be managed within capitalism. Still others claim that class is outdated, that modern society is too complex for binary class analysis. Marx would respond that other conflicts are real, but usually reflect underlying class dynamics. National wars often serve class interests, markets, resources, labor pools. Ethnic and racial divisions often benefit rulers by dividing potential opposition. Gender oppression interacts with class through unpaid domestic labor subsidizing capital. Class analysis does not deny these oppressions but situates them within capitalist social relations. The persistence of strikes, labor organizing, and political conflicts over economic policy suggests that class struggle remains relevant. Widening inequality and precarious employment indicate that class antagonisms have not disappeared. Whether this leads to revolutionary transformation or can be managed through reforms remains the central political question Marx posed. But that fundamental conflicts of interest exist between those who own capital and those who must sell labor seems difficult to deny. The specific forms change, but class struggle continues as long as exploitation persists. The Communist Manifesto, a call to arms. In December 1847, delegates from the Communist League, a small organization of radical workers and intellectuals, met in London and commissioned Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to write a statement of principles. The result, completed in January and published in February 1848, was a 23-page pamphlet titled The Communist Manifesto. It would become one of the most influential political texts ever written, translated into nearly every language and read by hundreds of millions. The timing was extraordinary. The manifesto appeared just as revolutionary upheavals swept across Europe. In February 1848, revolution in France overthrew King Louis-Philippe. Within weeks, revolutions erupted in German states, Italian principalities, the Austrian Empire. Workers and radicals built barricades, demanded republican government and social reforms. For a brief moment, the old order seemed to be crumbling exactly as Marx and Engels predicted. The revolutions ultimately failed. By 1849, conservative forces had reasserted control almost everywhere. But the Communist Manifesto had entered history. Its analysis and rhetoric would inspire revolutionary movements for generations. Its opening line became one of the most famous in political writing. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The manifesto is structured in 4 sections. The first section, Bourgeois and Proletarians, presents a sweeping analysis of capitalist development and class struggle. Marx and Engels begin with their famous declaration that all history is the history of class struggles. They then trace how the bourgeoisie arose from feudal society, constantly revolutionizing production and transforming the world in its image. The descriptions of capitalism's dynamism remain striking today. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. It has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It creates a world after its own image. These passages capture something essential about capitalism's restless, transformative character. But this development creates its own gravedigger. Modern industry produces the proletariat, the class of wage workers who own nothing but their labor power. As capitalism advances, workers become increasingly concentrated, organized, and unified. Their struggles against exploitation gradually move from individual resistance to collective action to political organization. The bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. The second section, Proletarians and Communists, explains what communists advocate and how they relate to the working class generally. Marx and Engels insist that communists have no interests separate from the proletariat as a whole. They do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They simply express the general interests of the movement and push toward the ultimate goal, abolition of private property in the means of production. This section addresses objections to communism. Critics claim communists want to abolish property generally. Marx and Engels respond that they want to abolish only bourgeois property, private ownership of means of production. Personal property, the things people use directly, would not be eliminated. The accusation that communism abolishes individuality is also rejected. Capitalism already abolishes the individuality of the vast majority, reducing them to abstract labor power. True individuality requires freedom from exploitation. The famous charge that communists want to abolish the family is addressed head-on. Marx and Engels argue that the bourgeois family is already undermined by capitalism, which tears children from families to work in factories and reduces family relations to mere money relations. They do want to end the exploitation of children by their parents and the treatment of women as property. The bourgeois family is based on capital and private gain. Its disappearance is inevitable. Similarly, the claim that communism abolishes nations and nationality is both accepted and reframed. Workers have no country. The proletariat must first acquire political supremacy in each nation, but national differences and antagonisms are already disappearing with the development of the world market. The working class has no interest in national divisions that serve only the bourgeoisie. The section ends with a brief positive sketch of communist society. Abolition of private property and means of production. Association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Class distinctions disappear. Public power loses its political character, since political power is organized force of one class to oppress another. We get only glimpses, but the vision is of a society without exploitation, where productive forces serve human needs rather than capital accumulation. The third section, Socialist and Communist Literature, is the most dated part of the manifesto. It critiques various other socialist movements of the time: feudal socialism, petty bourgeois socialism, German true socialism, conservative bourgeois socialism, and utopian socialism. Most of these movements have faded into obscurity. But the section makes an important point. Not all opposition to capitalism is progressive. Some critiques come from classes threatened by capitalism's advance and wish to restore earlier forms of exploitation. Others offer only superficial reforms that preserve the system's fundamentals. Genuine communism distinguishes itself by understanding capitalism's actual dynamics and advocating working-class revolution. The fourth section, Position of the Communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties, discusses practical politics. Communists should work with any movement fighting the existing social and political order. In France, they ally with social democrats. In Switzerland, with radicals. In Poland, with agrarian revolutionaries. In Germany, with the bourgeoisie against absolute monarchy, but without ceasing to instill working-class consciousness. The communists everywhere support revolutionary movements against existing conditions. The manifesto ends with its famous call. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all countries unite. The rhetorical power of the manifesto comes partly from its combination of analysis and advocacy, theory and practice. It does not just describe capitalism but calls for its overthrow. The writing is direct, passionate, sometimes satirical. Complex ideas are expressed in memorable phrases. The structure builds momentum toward the final call to action. But the manifesto's influence also stems from its analysis. The account of capitalism's development, class struggle, and internal contradictions provided a framework for understanding industrial society. The vision of capitalism as revolutionary yet temporary, as advancing productive forces while generating its own opposition, shaped thinking across the political spectrum. Even those who reject Marx's conclusions often accept elements of his analysis. The manifesto has been criticized from many directions. Its predictions of imminent revolution proved wrong. Capitalism proved more adaptable than Marx expected. Its emphasis on industrial workers ignored other social groups. Its dismissal of reforms in favor of revolution may have hindered practical improvements. Its vision of classless society remains vague. Its assumption that working-class revolution would bring freedom seems contradicted by 20th century experience. Yet the text remains relevant. Its analysis of capitalism's globalizing tendency describes our world. Its account of how economic imperatives overwhelm traditional relationships applies to contemporary disruptions. Its insistence that class conflict is fundamental resonates amid rising inequality. Its call for international working-class solidarity speaks to global economic integration, and its vision of a society organized around human needs rather than profit continues to inspire those dissatisfied with capitalism. The manifesto is a young person's text, written when Marx was 29 and Engels 27. It has the certainty and revolutionary optimism of youth. Marx's later work would be more careful, systematic, and pessimistic about revolutionary prospects. But the manifesto captures something essential, the conviction that capitalism is not eternal, that a better world is possible, and that working people have the power to create it. Whatever its flaws, that message has proven remarkably durable. Capital explained how money makes money. Capital is not simply money or machinery or factories. Capital is a social relationship, a process by which money expands itself through the exploitation of labor. Understanding this process was the central task of Marx's economic work, culminating in his masterpiece Das Kapital, the first volume of which appeared in 1867 after years of research and writing. The book is dense, difficult, and over 800 pages long. Marx begins not with capital itself, but with its elementary form, the commodity. A commodity is anything produced for exchange rather than direct use. In capitalism, nearly everything becomes a commodity: food, clothing, housing, even labor power itself. Understanding commodities is the key to understanding capital. Every commodity has two aspects. It has use value, its ability to satisfy some human need or want. Bread satisfies hunger. A coat provides warmth. Use value is qualitative and specific to each type of good. But commodities also have exchange value, the quantitative ratio in which they exchange for other commodities. One coat might exchange for 20 yards of linen or 2 ounces of gold. Exchange value appears as a relationship between things, but it actually expresses something about the labor embodied in them. What allows different commodities to be compared and exchanged? Not their physical properties, which are completely different, not their use values, which are incommensurable. Marx argues that exchange value reflects the abstract human labor embodied in commodities. When we exchange one coat for 20 yards of linen, we are implicitly equating the labor time required to produce them. This is the labor theory of value, which Marx adapted from classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Not the time any particular worker takes, but the average time under normal conditions of production with average skill and intensity. If it takes 4 hours on average to produce a coat and 1 hour to produce a yard of linen, the coat exchanges for approximately 4 yards. Labor itself is not homogeneous. Skilled labor counts as intensified simple labor. An hour of skilled carpentry might equal 2 or 3 hours of simple labor, but all concrete specific labor is reduced to abstract human labor in general when products enter exchange. The carpenter and the tailor perform different activities, but as value-creating labor, their work is equivalent. This seems abstract, but it explains real phenomena. Why do prices of mass-produced goods tend towards certain levels? Because competition forces producers towards socially necessary labor time. If one producer takes twice as long as competitors, they cannot charge twice the price. They either improve efficiency or go out of business. Why does mechanization reduce prices? Because it reduces labor time required. The value of commodities reflects labor time embodied in them. Money emerges from commodity exchange as a universal equivalent, a commodity that represents value in general. Historically, precious metals played this role because they are durable, divisible, and have value themselves through the labor required to extract and refine them. Modern fiat money is more complex, but it still functions as a representation of value, allowing measurement and facilitating exchange. Capital emerges when money enters a peculiar circuit. Simple commodity exchange follows the pattern CMC, commodity to money to commodity. A weaver sells cloth for money, then uses the money to buy bread. The purpose is obtaining use values. The money is merely a medium, but capital follows a different pattern. MCM, money to commodity to more money. A capitalist starts with money, uses it to purchase commodities, then sells commodities for more money than initially invested. This circuit only makes sense if M is greater than M if the capitalist ends with more money than they started with. The difference, M minus M, is surplus value. Capital is value that expands itself, money that generates more money. But where does this increase come from? If commodities exchange at their values, reflecting labor time embodied in them, how does extra value arise? Marx argues this is the fundamental puzzle of capitalism. It cannot be explained by buying cheap and selling dear, because one person's gain is another's loss. Overall, such exchanges redistribute existing value but create none. The secret lies in a special commodity the capitalist purchases: labor power. Labor power is the capacity to work, the worker's ability to produce use values. Under capitalism, workers sell their labor power to capitalists for a wage. Labor power is a commodity like any other, with use value and exchange value. Its exchange value, the wage, is determined by the labor time necessary to produce and reproduce it. The cost of food, shelter, clothing, education, and raising the next generation of workers. This is the value the capitalist pays. But the use value of labor power is special. It is the ability to create value, indeed to create more value than it costs. A worker might produce in 6 hours the value equivalent to a day's wage, but the capitalist can make them work 8, 10, or 12 hours. Those extra hours produce surplus value, value beyond what the capitalist paid for labor power. This surplus value is the source of profit. This is exploitation in Marx's technical sense. The capitalist appropriates value created by workers' labor beyond the value of labor power itself. It is not theft in the legal sense. The capitalist pays the full value of labor power. But the peculiar nature of labor power as a commodity means its use creates more value than its exchange value. The worker is paid for 6 hours but works 10. The difference is surplus value. Surplus value can be increased in two main ways. Absolute surplus value comes from extending the working day. If necessary, labor time is 6 hours and the working day extends from 10 to 12 hours, surplus value increases from 4 to 6 hours. This was common in early capitalism, with workers laboring 14 or 16 hours daily. But the working day has physical and social limits. Workers need rest, and eventually they organize to resist unlimited extension. Relative surplus value comes from reducing necessary labor time while keeping the working day constant. If productivity increases so that the value of labor power falls, workers can produce their wage equivalent in 4 hours rather than 6. With a 10-hour day, surplus labor increases from 4 to 6 hours without extending the working day. This occurs through mechanization, improved techniques, and more intense labor processes. The pursuit of relative surplus value drives capitalism's constant revolutionizing of production. Capitalists invest in machinery and technology to reduce labor time per unit produced. This gives them competitive advantage, allowing temporarily higher profits. But as the innovation spreads, the social average adjusts and the advantage disappears. The process begins again with new innovations. Capital exists in different forms. Money capital, M, begins the process. It purchases commodities. C, specifically means of production and labor power. These combine in production, P, where new commodities are created. The new commodities, C, contain more value than the original inputs. They are sold for money, M, which exceeds the initial investment. The full circuit is MC, P, C, M. Each phase presents obstacles. Money capital must find profitable investments. Means of production and labor power must be available. Production must occur successfully. The product must find buyers at profitable prices. Crises can emerge at any point. Overproduction, underconsumption, disruption of credit, shortage of labor, or technological change can interrupt the circuit. Individual capitalists compete, each trying to maximize profit, but their individual rationality produces collective irrationality. Each tries to reduce wages and increase productivity, but this can reduce aggregate demand. Each overproduces to gain market share, but total overproduction creates crises. Each introduces labor-saving technology, but this tends to reduce the rate of profit as living labor, the source of value, becomes relatively less important. Marx identified a tendency for the rate of profit to fall as capitalism develops. The rate of profit is surplus value divided by total capital invested. As technology advances, more capital goes into machinery and materials relative to labor power. Marx called this a rising organic composition of capital. Since only living labor creates new value, the ratio of surplus value to total capital invested tends to fall. Capitalists respond with counter tendencies, increasing exploitation, cheapening means of production, foreign trade, but the underlying tendency persists. This creates cycles of boom and bust. Profits attract investment. Investment expands production. Overproduction relative to profitable demand leads to crisis. Crisis destroys capital, laying groundwork for renewed profitability and a new cycle. Each crisis is both disaster and renovation, clearing away unprofitable capital and creating conditions for renewed accumulation. Capital is not a thing but a social relation. The machinery in a factory is not capital in itself, but becomes capital when owned by capitalists and used to extract surplus value from workers. Money in your pocket is not capital, but money invested to generate more money is. Capital is value in motion, constantly seeking to expand through exploitation of labor. This analysis has profound implications. Profit comes from unpaid labor, not from capital's productivity or risk-taking. Workers create all new value, but most of it is appropriated by capitalists. The system requires this exploitation to function. Without surplus value, there is no profit, no accumulation, no capitalism. You cannot reform away exploitation while maintaining capitalism, because exploitation is not a flaw, but the system's foundation. Critics argue that labor theory of value is flawed, that prices do not correspond to labor time, that Marx failed to solve the transformation problem of converting values to prices. Others claim that entrepreneurship, innovation, or capital's productivity contribute to value creation, not just labor. Still others accept Marx's analysis for his time, but argue that modern capitalism is fundamentally different. Marx would respond that prices fluctuate around values, that short-term deviations do not invalidate the underlying determinants, that entrepreneurship and innovation are forms of labor, and capital's productivity reflects embodied past labor. That while capitalism's forms change, its essential dynamics persist. Profit through surplus value extraction, competition driving technological change, cycles of boom and crisis. The specifics differ, but capital still expands by exploiting labor. Money still makes money through the hidden abode of production, where workers create more value than they receive. This fundamental relationship defines capitalism across all its variations. The labor theory of value, where profit comes from. If you buy a shirt for $20, what determines that price? Most people would say supply and demand. Marx would say ultimately labor time. The labor theory of value is the foundation of Marx's economic analysis, explaining not just prices but profit, exploitation, and capitalism's fundamental dynamics. Understanding it is essential to understanding Marx. The basic idea is simple. The value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. If a shirt requires 4 hours to make from raw materials to finished product, and a pair of shoes requires 8 hours, the shoes have twice the value of the shirt. Exchange ratios reflect these labor time differences. 2 shirts exchange for 1 pair of shoes because they embody equivalent labor. Marx did not invent this theory. Adam Smith suggested that in early society, the amount of labor required to acquire different goods determined their exchange value. David Ricardo developed the theory more systematically, arguing that the value of commodities depends on the quantity of labor necessary for production. Marx adopted and transformed their analysis, making it the basis for a critique of capitalism rather than a justification. Several clarifications are necessary. First, not individual labor time, but socially necessary labor time determines value. If one worker takes twice as long as average to make a shirt, the shirt does not have twice the value. Socially necessary labor time is the amount required under normal conditions of production with average skill and intensity. This average is established through competition. Inefficient producers either improve or exit. Second, different types of labor are reduced to simple abstract labor. An hour of skilled carpentry creates more value than an hour of unskilled labor, but this just means skilled labor counts as intensified simple labor. An hour of carpentry might equal 2 or 3 hours of simple labor. The market establishes these equivalences through wage differentials and training costs. Third, labor creates value only when producing commodities, goods produced for exchange. If you make a shirt for yourself, no value is created in the economic sense, though you have created a use value. Value is a social relation existing only in commodity production. It reflects the social organization of labor through market exchange rather than conscious planning. Fourth, concrete labor creates use values, but abstract labor creates value. Concrete labor is the specific activity. Weaving, carpentry, farming, each creates particular use values. Abstract labor is labor in general, expenditure of human brain, muscle, and nerve without regard to specific form. When products enter exchange, the concrete differences between labors dissolve into abstract equivalence. Value represents this abstract human labor. Why does labor determine value? Because in commodity production, private labors must be validated socially through exchange. Producers work independently, not knowing in advance whether their products will sell. The market retrospectively determines whether labor was socially necessary. If you produce something nobody wants or use outdated methods, that labor does not count as value creating. Social necessity is established through the anonymous pressure of competition. Money emerges to measure this abstract labor. Instead of directly exchanging shirts for shoes, we use money as universal equivalent. Money represents value in general, allowing measurement and facilitating exchange. Prices fluctuate around values due to supply and demand, but in the aggregate and over time, prices reflect labor time. When supply and demand balance, commodities exchange at their values. This theory explains what other theories cannot. The origin of profit in capitalism. If commodities exchange at their values, reflecting labor time embodied in them, how do capitalists end up with more value than they start with? Buying cheap and selling dear cannot explain it because one person's gain is another's loss. Where does the additional value come from? Marx's answer: labor power is a special commodity whose use creates more value than it costs. The capitalist purchases labor power at its value, the cost of producing and reproducing the worker. This might equal 6 hours of labor, but the capitalist can use this labor power for longer, say 10 hours. Those extra 4 hours produce surplus value, value beyond what the capitalist paid. This is the key insight. Profit is not payment for the capitalist's contribution, but unpaid labor. Workers produce more value than they receive as wages. The difference is surplus value, which appears as profit, interest, and rent. Exploitation is not subjective unfairness, but an objective feature of the wage-labor relationship. The worker is paid the full value of labor power, but produces more value than labor power is worth. The rate of exploitation is the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor. If necessary labor is 6 hours and surplus labor is 4 hours, the rate of exploitation is 4/6 or roughly 67%. Increasing exploitation means increasing surplus labor relative to necessary labor, either by lengthening the working day or by increasing productivity so necessary labor time falls. The labor theory of value also explains why mechanization and increased productivity reduce prices. Machines transfer their value to products gradually as they wear out. If a machine costs $10,000 and lasts for 10,000 hours, it transfers $1 of value per hour to products. But machines do not create new value, only living labor does. A highly mechanized production process might transfer much value from machines while adding little new value from labor. The result is lower value per unit produced. This creates a paradox. Capitalists introduce machinery to reduce labor costs and gain competitive advantage. But since only labor creates value, reducing labor relative to capital invested tends to lower the rate of profit. Individual rationality produces collective irrationality. Each capitalist pursues profit by reducing labor inputs, but together they undermine the source of profit itself. Critics raise several objections to the labor theory of value. First, they argue that prices do not correspond to labor times. Some commodities with equal labor content have different prices. Skilled and unskilled labor are not easily reduced to common units. Prices respond to supply and demand, not just labor time. Marx acknowledged that prices diverge from values. Competition causes capital to flow toward higher profit rates, equalizing rates of profit across industries. This transforms values into prices of production that diverge systematically from labor times. Industries with higher capital intensity have prices of production above values, while labor-intensive industries have prices below values. But these deviations balance out. Total prices equal total values, and total profit equals total surplus value. Second, critics argue that factors other than labor contribute to production. Capital equipment increases productivity. Natural resources have value. Entrepreneurship and organization matter. Why should only labor create value? Marx's response is that machines and materials represent past labor. Their value was created when they were produced and is merely transferred to new products. They do not create new value themselves. Natural resources have no value until labor is applied to extract and process them. Entrepreneurship and organization are forms of complex labor. The question is not whether these things contribute to production, but whether they create new value, which Marx argues only living labor does. Third, critics note the transformation problem. Converting values to prices of production is mathematically complex, and Marx's own solution has flaws. Later economists argued that you cannot derive prices from values without already knowing prices, making the theory circular. Defenders respond that Marx's solution can be corrected without abandoning the theory's core insights. The point is not that you can calculate individual prices from labor times, but that understanding capitalism requires seeing profit as rooted in exploitation of labor. The labor theory of value is a framework for analyzing capitalism as a whole, not a theory of price formation. Fourth, some argue the theory is unfalsifiable. If prices do not match labor times, defenders invoke deviations and transformations. If profit does not seem to come from labor, they invoke complex theoretical mechanisms. The theory explains everything after the fact but predicts nothing testable. Marx would reject this. The theory predicts that profit requires exploitation of labor, that mechanization tends to reduce profit rates, that competition forces producers towards socially necessary labor times, that capitalism produces cycles of boom and crisis. These are testable claims. The theory also explains phenomena that alternatives cannot, why profit persists across industries despite capital mobility, why mechanization reduces prices, why economic crises recur. The labor theory of value remains controversial even among economists sympathetic to Marx. Some Marxists have abandoned it, arguing that Marx's critique of capitalism can be reformulated without it. Others insist it is essential to understanding exploitation and profit. The debate continues, but the theory's political implications are clear. If profit comes from unpaid labor, capitalism necessarily involves exploitation. You cannot have capitalism without surplus value extraction. Reforms might improve workers' conditions but cannot eliminate exploitation while preserving the wage-labor relationship. The system requires workers to produce more value than they receive. This is not a moral failing of individual capitalists, but a structural feature of the mode of production. Ending exploitation requires transforming the economic system itself, establishing social ownership and democratic control of production. Whether the labor theory of value is theoretically correct or not, this political challenge remains central to debates about capitalism and alternatives to it. Commodity fetishism, when things control people. In capitalism, the products of human labor take on mysterious properties. They appear to have independent existence and power, as if animated by forces beyond human control. Prices rise and fall according to seemingly natural laws. Markets determine what gets produced and who has access to goods. Commodities govern human relationships rather than humans governing commodities. Marx called this phenomenon commodity fetishism, and understanding it is crucial to grasping how capitalism works and why it seems so natural. Fetishism means attributing supernatural qualities to objects. In religious fetishism, a statue or amulet is treated as if it possesses divine power. The object is worshipped, though it is actually just wood or stone shaped by human hands. Commodity fetishism is similar. Products of human labor appear to have independent power and value, as if these properties were natural rather than social. Consider a simple commodity like a coat. It has obvious physical properties: wool fabric, buttons, pockets. These come from its use value, its ability to provide warmth. But in capitalism, the coat also has exchange value. It can be traded for other commodities or sold for money. This exchange value appears as a property of the coat itself, like its color or weight. A coat is worth $50 the way it is blue or weighs 2 pounds. But exchange value is not a natural property. It is a social relation disguised as a thing's property. The coat's exchange value reflects the social organization of labor in capitalism. It exists only because of a particular way of organizing production, private producers working independently, coordinating through market exchange rather than conscious planning. The coat has exchange value only within this social system. The fetishism is that this social relation appears as a relation between things. Instead of recognizing that exchange value reflects human social organization, we experience it as an objective property of objects. The coat is worth $50, period. This seems as natural and objective as its physical characteristics. The social relation becomes a thing's property. This inversion has profound effects. In pre-capitalist societies, social relations are direct and transparent. A feudal serf knows exactly what is going on. The lord commands, the serf obeys, the surplus goes to the lord. The exploitation is visible and personal. Modern capitalism is different. The worker sells labor power in a seemingly voluntary exchange. The wage appears as payment for labor rather than payment for labor power. The appropriation of surplus value is invisible. Similarly, in earlier modes of production, the social organization of labor is direct. A village community might decide collectively what to produce and how to distribute it, or a lord might command what serfs produce. Either way, human decisions directly organize production. In capitalism, this coordination happens indirectly through the market. Producers work independently and only discover through exchange whether their labor was socially useful. The market coordinates, not conscious human planning. This makes the market seem like a natural force, like weather or gravity. Supply and demand determine prices the way natural laws determine planetary motion. Economic crises appear as natural disasters rather than results of human decisions and social organization. The economy becomes a thing that acts on people rather than a set of relationships between people. Commodity fetishism obscures the exploitation fundamental to capitalism. Profit seems to come from capital itself, from money's natural ability to generate more money. Interest seems to be what money naturally produces, like apple trees produce apples. Rent seems to flow from land's productivity. The reality that profit comes from unpaid labor disappears behind these surface forms. The wage relationship especially embodies this mystification. The worker appears to be paid for labor, for the work done. The wage seems to compensate the full working day, but actually the worker is paid for labor power, the capacity to work. The wage covers the cost of reproducing labor power, while the worker produces more value than this during the working day. The distinction between labor and labor power is crucial, but invisible in the wage form. Money is the ultimate fetish. It appears to have value in itself, to be naturally capable of buying commodities. But money is actually a social relation, a universal equivalent that allows measurement and exchange. Its power comes not from itself, but from the social system that makes it function as universal equivalent. Yet we experience money as having inherent power. It makes the world go round. It talks. It is desired not for what it can buy, but for itself. Capital carries fetishism even further. Capital seems to be self-expanding value, money that naturally generates more money. Interest-bearing capital reaches the peak of mystification. Money lent at interest returns with increment without apparently passing through production at all. The formula money directly generating more money, erases all traces of the productive process and the labor that creates value. Capital appears as an automatic subject, value perpetually in motion and self-expanding. Commodity fetishism is not just individual illusion or ignorance. It is produced by real features of capitalist commodity production. When labor is organized through private production and market exchange rather than conscious social planning, social relations necessarily appear as relations between things. The fetishism is objective, built into the system's structure. You cannot simply educate it away. This has political implications. Workers may struggle for higher wages without questioning the wage system itself. They may demand better prices without challenging commodity production. They may seek to control markets without recognizing that markets are themselves the problem. The system's real relations remain invisible behind fetishized forms. Commodity fetishism also affects how people think about economics. Mainstream economics often takes commodity and money relations as natural, as simply the way economic activity happens. It studies market mechanisms without questioning why production is organized through markets in the first place. It treats capital as productive without recognizing it as a social relation of exploitation. It reifies categories specific to capitalism into eternal economic laws. Marx's analysis of fetishism is part of his broader critique of ideology. Ideology is not simply false ideas, but ideas that arise from and reflect actual social relations while disguising their real character. Commodity fetishism is ideological in this sense. The idea that commodities have natural value is false, but it reflects real features of how capitalism works. The mystification is produced by the system itself. Breaking through fetishism requires understanding capitalism as a specific historical form of social organization, not a natural or eternal condition. Commodity production, wage labor, capital accumulation are historically specific, not inherent to human nature or economic activity. Recognizing this creates space for imagining alternatives. If these relations are socially produced, they can be socially transformed. Marx contrasts capitalism with what he calls an association of free individuals. In such a society, production would be consciously planned to meet human needs. Products would not take commodity form because they would not be produced for exchange. Labor would be directly social rather than becoming social only through market validation. The allocation of labor to different tasks would be transparent and democratically decided rather than mystified through market mechanisms. In this alternative, fetishism would disappear. Economic relations would be recognized as human relations subject to human control. Products would be seen as products of human labor organized for human purposes. Value would not appear as a property of things, but would be understood as reflecting labor allocation decisions. The economy would be denaturalized, recognized as a human creation that can be consciously organized. Critics argue that markets are necessary for economic coordination in complex societies, that conscious planning cannot match market efficiency. Even if fetishism exists, it may be the price of prosperity. Others claim fetishism is not distinctively capitalist but characterizes all money economies or even all symbolic systems. Still others argue that modern consumers are quite aware of social relations behind commodities and that Marx overestimated mystification. Marx might respond that markets are one way to coordinate but not the only way, and that their efficiency comes with costs including regular crises and systematic inequality. That fetishism takes specific forms in capitalism that differ from earlier money economies. That awareness of exploitation does not eliminate it, and that fetishism operates at structural levels even when individuals are sophisticated. The concept of commodity fetishism remains one of Marx's most influential contributions. It explains why capitalism seems natural despite being historically specific. It shows how economic categories can obscure rather than reveal real social relations. It suggests that transforming capitalism requires not just redistributing wealth but changing the fundamental social organization of production. And it demonstrates how the things we create can come to dominate us, how human products can become alien powers ruling over human life. Until production is consciously organized to meet human needs, commodity fetishism will persist and things will continue to control the people who made them. Surplus value, the secret of capitalism. At the heart of Marx's economic analysis lies a secret. Capitalism presents itself as a system of free exchange where everyone receives equivalent value. Workers sell labor, capitalists provide employment, exchanges occur between equals. Yet somehow capitalists accumulate wealth while workers remain workers. Where does this wealth come from? The answer is surplus value, and understanding it unlocks the mystery of how capitalism actually functions. Surplus value is the difference between the value workers create and the value they receive as wages. A worker might produce goods worth $100 in a day, but receive a wage of $60. The $40 difference is surplus value, appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This is not theft in the legal sense. The capitalist pays the full value of what they purchase, labor power. But labor power has a unique property. Its use creates more value than it costs. To understand this, we must distinguish between labor and labor power. Labor is the actual activity of working, the expenditure of human effort in production. Labor power is the capacity to work, the worker's ability to perform labor. Under capitalism, workers do not sell their labor, but their labor power. They sell their ability to work for a specified time period. Labor power is a commodity like any other. It has a value determined by the labor time necessary to produce it. But what does it mean to produce labor power? It means reproducing the worker as a living, capable person. The value of labor power equals the value of the commodities necessary to maintain the worker: food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare. It also includes the cost of raising the next generation of workers, reproducing the working class itself. This value varies historically and geographically. Workers in wealthy countries require more to maintain their accustomed standard of living than workers in poor countries. The value includes not just physical subsistence, but also historically developed expectations and social norms. But at any given time and place, the value of labor power can be determined with reasonable precision. The capitalist purchases labor power at its value, paying a wage that covers these reproduction costs. This seems fair. The worker receives equivalent value for what they sell. But here is the secret. The use value of labor power is its ability to create value, and it can create more value than it itself possesses. A worker whose labor power is worth $60 can work to produce $100 of value. Imagine a working day of 10 hours. Perhaps the worker produces in 6 hours the equivalent value of their daily wage, $60. These 6 hours Marx calls necessary labor time, necessary to reproduce the value of labor power. But the capitalist does not stop the workday after 6 hours. The worker continues for another 4 hours, producing an additional $40 of value. These 4 hours are surplus labor time, and the $40 produced is surplus value. The worker has been paid fairly according to capitalist logic. They sold labor power at its value. But the capitalist extracts more value from the use of labor power than the labor power itself is worth. This is exploitation not as moral judgment, but as technical description of the relationship. Value is transferred from worker to capitalist through the wage-labor relationship. Surplus value is the sole source of profit in Marx's analysis. It is also the source of interest, rent, and all other forms of capitalist income. When a capitalist pays interest on a loan, that money ultimately comes from surplus value extracted from workers. When a landlord collects rent, the tenant pays from wages that are only part of the value they produced, with the rest going to their employer as surplus value. The entire income of the capitalist class derives from the unpaid labor of the working class. Marx distinguished between absolute and relative surplus value, two methods by which capitalists increase the exploitation of labor. Absolute surplus value comes from extending the length of the working day or the intensity of work. If necessary labor is 6 hours and the working day extends from 10 to 12 hours, surplus labor increases from 4 to 6 hours. The rate of surplus value rises from 67% to 100%. The struggle over the length of the working day was central to 19th century labor conflicts. Capitalists constantly pushed for longer hours to extract more surplus value. Workers organized to resist, demanding 10-hour days, then 8-hour days. Legislation eventually limited working hours, but this did not eliminate surplus value extraction, only constrained one method of increasing it. Relative surplus value is more sophisticated. It comes from reducing necessary labor time while keeping the working day constant. This occurs through increasing productivity. If productivity doubles in industries producing wage goods, the value of labor power falls by half. If labor power previously required 6 hours to reproduce, it now requires only 3. With a 10-hour day, surplus labor increases from 4 to 7 hours, even though the working day length is unchanged. The pursuit of relative surplus value drives capitalism's constant revolutionizing of production methods. Capitalists invest in machinery, reorganize production processes, introduce scientific management techniques, all to reduce the labor time required per unit of output. Initially, the innovating capitalist gains extra surplus value because their production costs fall below the social average while they can still sell at prevailing prices. But as the innovation spreads, the social average adjusts downward and the advantage disappears. This creates a treadmill effect. Each capitalist must innovate to keep up with competitors. Those who fall behind are driven out. The result is continuous transformation of production technology and work organization. What appears as progress and innovation is driven by the search for surplus value. The visible dynamism of capitalism rests on invisible exploitation. Marx also analyzed the rate and mass of surplus value. The rate of surplus value is surplus labor divided by necessary labor, or surplus value divided by variable capital paid as wages. If a worker produces $100 of value and receives $60 in wages, the rate of surplus value is 40 divided by 60, or 67%. This measures the intensity of exploitation. The mass of surplus value is the total amount extracted, which depends on both the rate and the number of workers exploited. A capitalist employing 1,000 workers at 67% exploitation rate produces more total surplus value than one employing 100 workers at the same rate. This drives capitalists to employ as many workers as profitably possible. But there is a contradiction. Individual capitalists profit by reducing their workforce through mechanization, replacing living labor with machinery. Yet surplus value comes only from living labor. As the proportion of capital invested in machinery rises relative to labor, the rate of profit tends to fall even as individual capitalists pursue rational strategies to maximize their own profits. This is one of capitalism's internal contradictions. The concept of surplus value demolishes justifications for capitalist profit. Profit does not reward the capitalist's abstinence or risk-taking. It is not payment for the productive contribution of capital. It is unpaid labor. The capitalist contributes nothing to the value of the product but appropriates part of what workers create. The legal right to this appropriation comes from ownership of means of production, not from productive activity. Neither is profit justified by the capitalist organizing production or taking risks. Organization and management are forms of labor and could be compensated as such without requiring capitalist ownership. Risk primarily falls on workers, who face unemployment and destitution if enterprises fail, while capitalists can diversify holdings. Even when capitalists lose money, workers lose livelihoods. Surplus value also explains the fundamental antagonism between capital and labor. Capitalists want to maximize surplus value by extending the working day, intensifying labor, reducing wages, and increasing productivity. Workers want shorter hours, lighter work, higher wages, and control over production processes. These interests are structurally opposed. Class struggle is not a misunderstanding but reflects real conflicting interests built into the wage-labor relationship. The wage form obscures surplus value. The wage appears as payment for labor, for the work performed. It seems to compensate the entire working day. The distinction between paid and unpaid labor disappears. Workers may feel they are paid fairly if the wage is decent, unaware that they produce more value than they receive. The extraction of surplus value is invisible in the wage transaction. This invisibility is crucial to capitalism's stability. In earlier exploitative systems, the division between necessary and surplus labor was visible. A serf worked 3 days a week on their own plot and 3 days on the lord's land. The exploitation was transparent. Under capitalism, necessary and surplus labor occur in the same place and time, indistinguishable in the labor process. Only theoretical analysis reveals the division. Critics raise several objections. First, they argue that capitalists deserve profit for providing capital, taking risks, and organizing production. Marx responds that providing capital is not productive activity, but ownership claim based on past accumulation, itself rooted in exploitation or primitive accumulation through force and fraud. Risk and organization could be compensated without capitalist ownership and profit. Second, critics claim that profit reflects capital's productivity, that machinery and technology contribute to value creation. Marx argues that machines transfer their own value to products as they wear out, but create no new value. Only living labor creates new value. Machines increase labor productivity, but do not themselves produce value. Third, some argue that in modern capitalism, with widespread stock ownership and high wages for skilled workers, the simple distinction between capitalists and workers breaks down. Marx might respond that ownership of small stock portfolios does not make workers into capitalists, and that high wages for some workers do not eliminate surplus value extraction. As long as production is organized around profit and wage labor, surplus value exists. The concept of surplus value remains controversial but powerful. It provides a systematic explanation for profit that mainstream economics lacks. It shows that exploitation is not aberration but foundation of the system. It reveals that apparent freedom and equality in market exchange coexist with exploitation in production. And it demonstrates that conflict between capital and labor is not resolvable within capitalism, but requires fundamental transformation of property relations and production organization. Whether one accepts Marx's specific formulation or not, the question he raises persists. Where does profit come from, and is it justified? Surplus value theory offers one answer, and those who reject it must provide another. The capitalist contradiction, seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism appears robust, adaptive, triumphant. It has outlasted feudalism, survived revolutions, spread across the globe. Yet Marx argued that capitalism contains internal contradictions that ultimately make it unsustainable. These contradictions are not external problems that can be fixed, but inherent features of how the system operates. They are, in Marx's famous phrase, the seeds of capitalism's own destruction. The fundamental contradiction is between social production and private appropriation. Production under capitalism becomes increasingly social. Thousands of workers cooperate in complex chains of production. Raw materials flow through global supply networks. Products require coordination of countless specialized tasks. No individual produces anything alone. Production is collective, yet appropriation remains private. The products of this social labor are owned by individual capitalists. The surplus value created by collective labor is privately appropriated as profit. Decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, and what to do with the surplus are made privately by capitalists pursuing individual profit, not socially in the collective interest. This creates a basic irrationality. Production is organized for private profit rather than social need. Goods are produced only if they can be sold profitably, not based on whether people need them. Food is destroyed while people starve because distributing it for free would not be profitable. Houses stand empty while people are homeless because they cannot afford rent. The social productive capacity is subordinated to private accumulation. Another fundamental contradiction exists between use value and exchange value. Capitalism produces commodities, goods made for sale rather than direct use. What matters is not whether products are useful, but whether they can be sold at a profit. This drives peculiar outcomes. Planned obsolescence makes products wear out faster to ensure repeat sales. Advertising creates artificial needs. Harmful products are sold if profitable. The use value of products becomes secondary to their exchange value. Production and consumption also contradict each other. Capitalists want to minimize wages as production costs, but wages are also the source of consumer demand. Each individual capitalist benefits from paying workers as little as possible, but collectively this reduces purchasing power. Workers produce commodities but cannot afford to buy back what they produce. This creates tendencies toward overproduction and underconsumption, contributing to economic crises. The contradiction between individual rationality and collective irrationality runs throughout capitalism. Each capitalist rationally pursues profit through competition, cost-cutting, and expansion. But collectively, these rational behaviors produce irrational outcomes. All capitalists introduce labor-saving technology to reduce costs, but together they reduce the proportion of value-creating labor in production, tending to lower the profit rate. All produce more to gain market share, but collectively they overproduce relative to profitable demand. Competition itself embodies contradiction. Capitalism requires competition to function, driving innovation and efficiency. Yet competition leads to concentration and monopoly. Successful firms drive out competitors, growing larger through mergers and acquisitions. Markets become dominated by a few large corporations. Competition undermines itself, transforming into oligopoly or monopoly. The system requires competition but generates concentration. The tendency for the rate of profit to fall represents another crucial contradiction. As capitalism develops, the organic composition of capital rises. More capital is invested in machinery and materials relative to labor. Marx calls the former constant capital because it merely transfers its value to products, and the latter variable capital because it creates new value including surplus value. As constant capital grows relative to variable capital, the ratio of surplus value to total capital invested tends to fall. This occurs even if the rate of exploitation increases. Imagine a capitalist invests $80 in machinery and materials and $20 in wages, total $100. If the rate of exploitation is 100%, surplus value is $20 and the profit rate is 20%. Now suppose mechanization increases so investment is $90 in constant capital and $10 in variable capital. Even if exploitation doubles to 200%, surplus value is only $20 on total capital of 100, still 20%. Further mechanization might raise constant capital to 95 and lower variable capital to 5. Even with 400% exploitation, surplus value is $20 on 100 invested, still 20% profit rate. Eventually, the profit rate must fall. Capitalists employ counter tendencies. They increase exploitation through longer hours, more intense work, lower wages. They cheapen constant capital through productivity gains in producing machinery. They seek foreign markets and cheaper labor abroad. They destroy capital through crises, clearing the ground for renewed profitable investment. But these counter tendencies cannot permanently reverse the underlying tendency. The contradiction persists. Crises themselves manifest capitalism's contradictions. Periodic crises of overproduction reveal the anarchy of capitalist production. Each capitalist produces without knowing what others are producing or what total social demand is. They discover through the market whether their production was socially necessary. But this discovery comes after production, leading to regular mismatches between production and demand. Too much is produced relative to profitable sales. Unsold commodities pile up, prices fall, firms go bankrupt, workers are laid off. The crisis destroys capital and reduces production until profitability is restored and a new cycle begins. These crises are not accidents or policy failures, but necessary moments in capitalism's rhythm. They result from the system's fundamental features: production for profit, competition between capitals, lack of planning, antagonism between production and consumption. Crises violently restore balance but cannot prevent future crises because the underlying contradictions remain. The contradiction between productive forces and relations of production operates at a deeper level. Productive forces are the technical capacity for production, tools, knowledge, skills, organization. Relations of production are the social framework, property rights, class relations, legal systems. Capitalism dramatically develops productive forces through competition and profit-seeking. But at a certain point, the capitalist relations of production become fetters on further development. Private ownership, production for profit, wage labor inhibit full use of productive capacity. Factories close while people need products because operating them is not profitable. Research is restricted by intellectual property rights. Cooperation is limited by competitive secrecy. The productive forces outgrow the social relations within which they developed. Revolution becomes possible when new relations of production can better accommodate advanced productive forces. For Marx, this meant that capitalism creates the material preconditions for socialism. It develops productive forces to high levels. It socializes production through cooperation and integration. It creates a working class with both the interest and potentially the capacity to transform the system. But capitalist property relations prevent humanity from consciously controlling and using these productive forces for collective benefit. The contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation reaches a point where resolution requires transcending capitalism itself. The working class embodies capitalism's central contradiction. Capital requires labor to create surplus value, but must exploit labor to generate profit. It needs workers, but must keep them propertyless to ensure they sell their labor power. It depends on workers' cooperation in production, but must suppress their collective power to protect profits. The working class is simultaneously essential to capitalism and the force that can overthrow it. As capitalism develops, it tends to homogenize and unify the working class. Craft distinctions erode, workers become more interchangeable. Large-scale production concentrates workers in factories and cities, facilitating organization. Common experiences of exploitation create potential for class consciousness. Though capital works to divide workers through racism, nationalism, and skill hierarchies, the underlying commonality of position creates basis for solidarity. Globalization extends these contradictions worldwide. Capital flows globally seeking cheaper labor and new markets, but this creates a global working class. Environmental destruction reveals the contradiction between capital's need for endless growth and the planet's finite capacity. Financial crises demonstrate how integration of global capital creates systemic fragility. The contradictions Marx identified in 19th century Britain now operate on planetary scale. Critics argue that capitalism has proven more adaptable than Marx expected. Welfare states moderate inequality. Keynesian policies manage crises. New technologies create new profit opportunities. Working classes have been divided and co-opted rather than radicalized. Capitalism has not collapsed under its contradictions, but has managed them. Marx might respond that managing contradictions is not resolving them. Crises recur despite policy interventions. Inequality widens despite welfare provisions. Ecological crisis intensifies despite green capitalism. The contradictions persist in new forms, and that the question is not whether capitalism collapses automatically, but whether the working class organizes to transform it. The contradictions Marx identified remain recognizable in contemporary capitalism. Production is more socialized than ever through global supply chains, yet ownership is concentrated in fewer hands. Productive capacity is immense, yet poverty persists. Technology could reduce working hours, yet many work longer. Wealth accumulates at one pole, precarity at another. The system produces abundance and deprivation simultaneously. Whether these contradictions will destroy capitalism or can be perpetually managed remains the central question. Marx argued they create both the necessity and possibility of revolution. The necessity comes from intensifying crises and exploitation. The possibility comes from concentrated organized workers and developed productive forces capable of supporting an alternative system. But contradictions do not resolve themselves automatically. They create conditions for transformation that must be seized through conscious collective action. The seeds of destruction exist, but whether they germinate depends on human agency operating within these structural constraints. False consciousness, the invisible chains. One of the great puzzles of class society is why the oppressed so often accept their oppression. Why do workers not rise up against exploitation? Why do they sometimes support systems and policies against their own interests? The answer in Marxist analysis involves false consciousness, the acceptance of ideas that obscure or justify exploitation. Understanding false consciousness is crucial to understanding why capitalism persists despite its contradictions and why revolutionary change is so difficult. The term false consciousness itself does not appear frequently in Marx's own writing, but was developed by later Marxists, particularly Friedrich Engels. The concept, however, is central to Marx's analysis. It refers to the gap between people's actual class position and their understanding of that position and their interests. Workers who identify with their employers, poor people who support policies benefiting the rich, oppressed groups who internalize ideologies justifying their oppression, all exhibit false consciousness. False consciousness is not simple ignorance or stupidity. It arises from real features of how capitalism works. The system itself generates appearances that obscure underlying realities. The wage seems to be payment for labor rather than for labor power. Profit seems to come from capital's productivity rather than unpaid labor. Economic processes seem to follow natural laws rather than social relations. These mystifications are produced by the system's structure, not invented by propagandists. Ideology plays a crucial role in maintaining false consciousness. For Marx, ideology is not just any set of ideas, but specifically ideas that reflect and justify existing social relations, while presenting them as natural, eternal, or just. The ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. Those who control material production also control mental production. They own media, fund think tanks, control education, shape public discourse. The ideas that circulate widely tend to be those serving ruling class interests. But ideology is not simple manipulation. It works because it connects to real experiences and partial truths. The ideology of individual freedom resonates because capitalism does provide certain freedoms to change employers, to buy various products, to pursue different lifestyles. The ideology ignores that these freedoms coexist with fundamental unfreedom, the necessity to sell labor power, subordination to capital in production, powerlessness over major economic decisions, but the partial truth makes the ideology convincing. Similarly, the ideology of meritocracy holds that success comes from hard work and talent. This resonates with real experiences. Some people do rise through effort, skills do matter, but the ideology obscures that class position at birth largely determines outcomes, that capital ownership matters more than personal effort, that the game is rigged in fundamental ways. The partial truth disguises the larger lie. Religious ideology historically played a major role in maintaining false consciousness. Marx's famous description of religion as the opium of the people is often misunderstood. He was not simply dismissing religion as deliberate deception. Religion provides real comfort in a harsh world. It offers meaning and community. But it also teaches acceptance of suffering, promises justice in an afterlife rather than this world, and often explicitly supports existing hierarchies as divinely ordained. It is an opiate in that it dulls pain without curing disease. In modern capitalism, secular ideologies serve similar functions. Nationalism divides workers along national lines, making them identify with domestic capitalists against foreign workers rather than recognizing international class solidarity. Racism and sexism divide the working class, allowing segments to feel superior to others and distracting from common exploitation. Consumerism directs desires toward commodity acquisition rather than political transformation. Entertainment and spectacle absorb attention and energy. Education systems play a dual role. They provide skills necessary for production, but also inculcate ruling class ideology. Schools teach that capitalism is natural, that success comes from individual effort, that the existing order is democratic and just. They promote competition over cooperation, obedience over critical thinking, acceptance over rebellion. Most teaching occurs not through explicit propaganda, but through assumptions embedded in curriculum and institutional structure. Media operates similarly. Ownership by wealthy corporations and dependence on advertising create systematic biases. Stories that challenge capitalism fundamentally are rare. Narratives of individual success are common. Problems are presented as resulting from bad individuals or policies, not systemic features. Alternatives to capitalism are ignored or caricatured. The range of acceptable opinion is policed subtly but effectively. False consciousness also has a material basis in the structure of work and daily life. Workers experience their relationship with employers as individuals. Each negotiates their own wage, works in their assigned position, pursues individual advancement. The collective nature of production and exploitation is less visible than individual circumstances. Each worker may blame themselves for low wages or unemployment rather than recognizing systemic causes. The separation of economic and political spheres contributes to false consciousness. Workers may recognize economic exploitation in the workplace, but see politics as a separate realm where they are equal citizens. The appearance of political democracy obscures economic dictatorship. Voting every few years creates an illusion of control, while real power remains with capital. The political system appears to offer redress, but actually serves to manage conflicts within acceptable bounds. Time pressure and exhaustion limit workers' capacity to develop class consciousness. Long working hours, tiring labor, and family responsibilities leave little energy for political education and organization. Entertainment provides escape rather than enlightenment. The daily grind of survival prevents the sustained thought and collective discussion necessary for developing critical consciousness. This is not accidental, but serves ruling class interests. False consciousness takes specific forms for different class segments. For the petty bourgeoisie, small business owners identify with capitalists despite being squeezed by large capital. They blame workers and regulations rather than recognizing their common exploitation. For middle-class professionals, relative privilege creates identification with the system despite their own exploitation through wage labor. For the poorest workers, survival pressures may create fatalism rather than radicalism. Yet false consciousness is never complete or permanent. Contradictions between ideology and experience create openings. When hard work does not bring success, meritocracy ideology is questioned. When crises destroy savings and jobs, faith in the system weakens. When struggles bring victories, people recognize their collective power. Experience can break through ideology, though this is neither automatic nor easy. The development of class consciousness requires moving from false consciousness to accurate understanding of class position and interests. This involves several steps. First, recognizing one's position as worker, understanding that selling labor power defines one's fundamental economic relation. Second, identifying common interests with other workers against capital. Third, understanding that these interests cannot be realized within capitalism but require systemic transformation. Fourth, developing organizational capacity to struggle collectively. This process is facilitated by several factors. Concentration of workers in large enterprises creates opportunities for communication and solidarity. Struggles over wages and conditions provide experiences of collective power. Crises expose the system's irrationality and ruling class incompetence. Socialist organizations and education can articulate what workers experience but may not initially understand. Theory connects with practice to transform consciousness. But the ruling class actively works to maintain false consciousness. It offers concessions when necessary to prevent radicalization. It promotes divisions within the working class. It co-opts leaders and movements. It uses state repression when ideology fails. The development of class consciousness is a contested process, not an automatic unfolding. Critics argue that the concept of false consciousness is patronizing, implying that workers are duped while intellectuals see truth. It risks dismissing any working class politics that do not match theoretical predictions as mere false consciousness. It can become unfalsifiable. If workers are radical, this confirms the theory. If not, they have false consciousness. Defenders respond that false consciousness does not mean workers are stupid, but that the system systematically obscures its real nature. That recognizing false consciousness does not require condescension, but solidarity and patient education. That the concept explains real phenomena, why workers sometimes support anti-labor politicians, why nationalism overcomes class solidarity, why revolutionary potential does not automatically translate into revolutionary consciousness. The concept also highlights the importance of cultural and ideological struggle alongside economic and political struggle. Transforming capitalism requires not just seizing state power or controlling means of production, but also transforming consciousness. Workers must come to see themselves as a class with collective interests and revolutionary potential. They must reject ideologies justifying exploitation and develop alternative visions of social organization. In contemporary capitalism, false consciousness takes new forms. The ideology of the entrepreneur valorizes risk-taking and innovation while ignoring exploitation. The gig economy is presented as freedom and flexibility while creating precarity and insecurity. Self-help ideology places responsibility for economic success or failure entirely on individuals. Social media creates illusions of connection while fragmenting collective organization. Newer forms of control operate alongside older ones. Yet resistance and critical consciousness persist. Labor movements continue organizing. Movements against racism, sexism, and environmental destruction challenge capitalism's logic. Education and communication technologies can spread critical ideas alongside dominant ideologies. The contradiction between capitalism's promises and its delivery creates ongoing skepticism and resistance. False consciousness is powerful, but not total. The invisible chains can be recognized and broken, but this requires sustained effort to develop critical awareness and collective organization capable of transforming social relations themselves. Base and superstructure: how economics shapes everything. Why do legal systems protect private property? Why do political institutions generally serve the wealthy? Why do dominant ideas tend to justify existing arrangements? Marx's answer involves the relationship between base and superstructure, one of his most important but also most debated concepts. Understanding this relationship is crucial to grasping how capitalism reproduces itself not just economically, but socially, politically, and culturally. The base, or economic foundation, consists of the forces and relations of production. The forces of production include tools, technology, raw materials, and human knowledge and skills. The relations of production are the social relationships governing who owns and controls the means of production and how products are distributed. Together, these constitute the mode of production, the economic structure of society. The superstructure includes everything built on this economic foundation: law, politics, religion, philosophy, art, education, media, culture. These are not separate from the economy, but arise from it and serve to reproduce it. They are superstructural in the sense that they rest on the economic base, deriving from it and shaped by it. Marx's famous formulation appears in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. This suggests that how people produce and organize economic life shapes how they think, organize politically, and create culture. The relationship is not mechanical determinism. The base does not directly cause each element of the superstructure in a one-to-one correspondence. Rather, the economic structure sets limits and exerts pressures. It creates possibilities and constraints within which superstructural forms develop. A feudal economy supports monarchy and aristocracy, but not liberal democracy. Capitalism supports parliamentary systems and individual rights, but not feudal hierarchies. Consider law. Legal systems protect property rights, enforce contracts, and regulate labor relations. These laws are not neutral, but reflect and reinforce capitalist economic relations. Property law protects private ownership of means of production. Contract law treats the wage bargain as an agreement between equals despite vast power imbalances. Labor law generally restricts workers' collective action more than capital's power. The law appears universal and neutral, but actually serves specific class interests. Yet law has relative autonomy. It develops according to its own internal logic, professional norms, and accumulated precedents. Judges are not simply instruments of the capitalist class. Legal reasoning follows formal rules. Sometimes courts rule against particular capitalists. Workers can win legal victories. But the legal system as a whole operates within limits set by capitalist property relations. It can moderate capitalism but not fundamentally challenge private ownership and wage labor. Political institutions show similar patterns. Democratic political systems emerged alongside capitalism, providing forums to manage conflicts within the ruling class and between classes. Universal suffrage, civil liberties, and representative government are real achievements. But political democracy coexists with economic oligarchy. Wealth translates into political power through campaign donations, lobbying, media ownership, and control of information. The political system is relatively open, but operates within constraints protecting capitalist fundamentals. Politics has autonomy from immediate economic control. Politicians are not simply puppets. Elections are genuine contests. Reforms can be won through political struggle. The state mediates between competing capitals and manages class conflict. It can even act against short-term capitalist interests to preserve long-term system stability. But it cannot transcend its role of maintaining conditions for capital accumulation without ceasing to be a capitalist state. Religion provides another example. In feudalism, the Catholic Church was a major economic power owning vast lands and extracting tithes. Religious ideology justified the social hierarchy as divinely ordained. Kings ruled by God's grace. Suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. The church was deeply embedded in the feudal economic and political structure. Capitalism secularized but did not eliminate religion's ideological role. Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, developed alongside capitalism with its emphasis on individual responsibility, hard work, and worldly success as signs of grace. Religion taught obedience to authority, acceptance of one's station, and focus on spiritual rather than material concerns. It provided comfort without challenging economic relations. As Marx observed, religious suffering is both an expression of real suffering and a protest against it, but also an opiate that dulls pain without addressing causes. Education systems serve to reproduce the class structure across generations. Schools provide skills necessary for production, literacy, numeracy, technical knowledge, but they also socialize students into acceptance of hierarchy, obedience to authority, and competition. Working-class schools emphasize discipline and basic skills. Elite schools teach leadership and critical thinking. The education system tracks students toward different class positions while appearing meritocratic. Cultural production, including art, literature, and entertainment, also connects to the economic base. Under capitalism, culture becomes increasingly commodified. Art is produced for profit. Cultural goods are marketed and sold. This shapes what gets produced. Commercially viable content over challenging work, escapism over critical reflection, spectacle over substance. Yet artists resist commodification, and culture retains some autonomy to critique and imagine alternatives. The media operates as a crucial superstructural institution. Owned by wealthy corporations and dependent on advertising revenue, media systematically presents news and entertainment serving ruling class interests. This occurs not through crude censorship, but through structural biases. What gets covered, how it is framed, which experts are consulted, which perspectives are legitimized. The media shapes public consciousness in ways that generally support existing arrangements. Ideology is the most subtle superstructural element. It consists of the ideas, values, and beliefs that make the existing order seem natural, inevitable, or just. Capitalist ideology includes beliefs in individual freedom, private property, market efficiency, and meritocracy. These ideas are not simply false, but contain partial truths that make them convincing while obscuring systemic exploitation and offering no alternative vision. The superstructure functions to reproduce the economic base. Legal systems enforce property relations. Political institutions manage class conflict. Education trains workers and reproduces class positions. Culture provides legitimation and distraction. Ideology makes exploitation seem acceptable. Together, these institutions stabilize capitalism, ensuring its continued operation across generations. But the relationship is dialectical, not one way. The superstructure can influence the base. Legal changes can facilitate economic development or constrain it. Political struggles can win reforms improving workers' conditions. Cultural shifts can create demands for economic changes. Revolutionary transformation requires changing both base and superstructure, neither of which can be transformed without the other. This raises questions about political strategy. If the superstructure is determined by the base, can political or cultural struggle achieve fundamental change? Must economic transformation come first, or can superstructural changes accumulate to transform the base? Marx suggests that ultimately the base is determinant, but in complex mediated ways, allowing space for political and cultural struggle. The concept also explains historical change. When productive forces develop beyond what existing relations of production can accommodate, contradictions intensify throughout society. Economic crises multiply. Political instability increases. Cultural ferment challenges old certainties. The superstructure, which previously stabilized the system, begins to crack. Revolution becomes possible when both base and superstructure are in crisis. The French Revolution illustrates this. Feudal economic relations increasingly constrained developing capitalist forces of production. The bourgeoisie accumulated wealth but lacked political power. Enlightenment ideas challenged religious and monarchical authority. Economic crisis triggered political upheaval. The revolution transformed both base and superstructure, establishing capitalist economic relations and bourgeois political institutions. Marx argued that proletarian revolution would follow a similar pattern. Capitalist relations of production increasingly fetter socialized productive forces. Economic crises intensify. Workers develop class consciousness. Existing political institutions lose legitimacy. Revolutionary transformation establishes socialist economic relations and new political forms, workers' councils, planning institutions, participatory democracy. Critics raise several objections to base superstructure analysis. First, it seems to reduce everything to economics, ignoring the autonomy of politics, culture, and ideas. Second, it appears deterministic, as if the economic base mechanically produces the superstructure. Third, it is accused of being unfalsifiable. Any superstructural phenomenon can be explained as somehow serving the base. Later Marxists developed more nuanced versions of the theory, Antonio Gramsci emphasized how the superstructure gains autonomy and how cultural hegemony secures ruling class dominance more effectively than force. Louis Althusser argued for relative autonomy of superstructural levels and identified ideological state apparatuses that reproduce capitalism through consent rather than coercion. These refinements acknowledge complexity while maintaining that economics is ultimately determinant. The concept retains value for understanding contemporary capitalism. Why do governments bail out banks but not workers? Why do austerity policies consistently target social spending while protecting corporate profits? Why do media focus on individual responsibility rather than systemic causes? Why do educational reforms emphasize skills for employability rather than critical thinking? Base superstructure analysis suggests these patterns reflect how superstructural institutions serve to reproduce capitalist economic relations. Consider intellectual property law. Copyright and patents protect corporate control of knowledge and innovation. They appear as neutral protections for creators but actually serve to commodify information and maintain monopolies. The legal superstructure supports the economic base of contemporary capitalism, where intangible assets and information goods are increasingly central. The law did not cause this economic shift but adapts to support and reproduce it. Or consider the ideology of entrepreneurship. It valorizes risk-taking, innovation, and individual initiative. These values serve contemporary capitalism's need for flexibility and constant change. They make precarious work seem like freedom. They individualize economic outcomes, obscuring structural determinants. The cultural superstructure generates ideas and values that support economic arrangements. Environmental policy shows how the superstructure both reflects and constrains the base. Capitalism requires endless growth and resource extraction. Political institutions resist serious climate action because it threatens economic interests. Legal frameworks protect property rights that enable environmental destruction. Cultural emphasis on consumption drives resource use, yet environmental movements build political pressure. Scientific understanding challenges business as usual. The superstructure is shaped by the base but also contains contradictions and forces for change. The base superstructure concept ultimately highlights that capitalism is a total system, not just an economy. It shapes law, politics, culture, and consciousness. Challenging capitalism requires struggle across all these domains. Economic organizing must combine with political mobilization and cultural transformation. Winning state power without transforming economic relations leads to restoration of capitalism. Transforming property relations without political and cultural change leads to bureaucratic dictatorship. Comprehensive transformation requires understanding how base and superstructure interconnect. The theory also suggests limits of reform. Superstructural changes within capitalism can improve conditions but cannot transcend the system. Better laws, more democratic politics, progressive culture all help but cannot eliminate exploitation rooted in capitalist property relations. Fundamental change requires transforming the economic base, establishing social ownership and democratic control of production. This requires political revolution, but revolution that transforms economics, politics, law, and culture together. Base and superstructure must both change for either to change decisively. Revolution theory, breaking the chains. Revolution stands at the center of Marx's political vision, not gradual reform but fundamental rupture, not improvement within the system but transformation of the system itself. Marx believed capitalism would and should be overthrown through working-class revolution. Understanding his theory of revolution means grasping both why he thought revolution was necessary and how he thought it would occur. Revolution is necessary because capitalism cannot be reformed into something fundamentally different. Its defining features, private ownership of means of production and wage labor, generate exploitation and class conflict. You cannot have capitalism without surplus value extraction. You cannot have capitalism without some owning capital and others selling labor power. Reforms can moderate these features but not eliminate them. Universal suffrage, labor laws, welfare states improve workers' conditions but do not end exploitation. Capitalism with a human face is still capitalism. This does not mean reforms are worthless. Shorter working hours, higher wages, better conditions, democratic rights all matter enormously. Marx supported workers' struggles for immediate improvements, but he insisted reforms were insufficient. They could ease suffering, but not address root causes. They could buy time, but not resolve contradictions. Eventually, fundamental transformation would become necessary. Revolution becomes possible when contradictions intensify to a breaking point. Economic crises multiply and deepen. The system's irrationality becomes visible. Ruling class institutions lose legitimacy. Workers develop organization and consciousness. Material conditions and subjective readiness align. Revolution is not inevitable, but becomes possible under specific historical circumstances. Marx identified several objective preconditions for revolution. First, capitalism must develop productive forces sufficiently that a higher form of social organization becomes materially possible. Revolution in a society of scarcity would only redistribute poverty. But capitalism creates abundance, though it distributes it unequally. The productive capacity exists to meet everyone's needs. Only the social relations prevent this. Second, capitalism must create a revolutionary class with both the interest and capacity to transform society. The proletariat is this class. It is exploited, giving it interest in ending exploitation. It is concentrated in large enterprises and cities, facilitating organization. It operates socialized production, demonstrating collective capacity. It owns no property, so it has nothing to lose but chains and a world to win. Third, contradictions must intensify sufficiently that the system cannot continue in the old way. The rate of profit falls, crises become more severe, class conflict sharpens, the ruling class splits and loses confidence. The masses lose faith in existing institutions. Lenin later summarized this as, "The ruling class cannot govern in the old way, and the masses will not live in the old way." But objective conditions are insufficient. Subjective factors matter crucially. Workers must develop class consciousness, recognizing their common interests and revolutionary potential. They must organize politically, building institutions capable of challenging state power. They must develop revolutionary leadership capable of strategy and tactics. Consciousness, organization, and leadership transform potential into actuality. Class consciousness develops through struggle. Workers initially resist exploitation individually, working slowly, sabotaging machines, quitting. Then they organize collectively, forming unions, striking for better conditions. Through these struggles, they learn solidarity and collective power. They recognize their interests, oppose their employers. They develop organizational capacities. Economic struggle potentially becomes political struggle. But this development is neither automatic nor linear. Workers can remain at economistic consciousness, fighting for better wages and conditions without challenging capitalism itself. Nationalism, racism, and other ideologies can divide workers. Reforms can co-opt militancy. Repression can destroy organization. The move from trade union consciousness to revolutionary consciousness requires political education and leadership. Revolutionary organization is essential. Workers need institutions independent of capitalist state and employers. Trade unions defend immediate interests but usually accept capitalism's framework. Socialist parties articulate revolutionary aims and contest for state power. Workers' councils or Soviets can become organs of dual power and eventually new state forms. The organizational question is crucial. What forms can unite workers and prepare them to seize power? Marx's view of organization evolved. In 1848, he expected imminent revolution and emphasized the Communist League's role in pushing workers toward revolutionary conclusions. After the failures of 1848, he focused on building international working-class organizations and studying capitalism more systematically. The First International attempted to unite diverse workers' movements across national boundaries. Later, social democratic parties emerged as mass organizations combining electoral politics with revolutionary aims. The revolutionary process itself involves several stages. First, defensive struggles against attacks on living standards build organization and consciousness. Second, offensive struggles for better conditions demonstrate workers' power. Third, political struggles challenge state power directly. Fourth, revolutionary crisis emerges when the ruling class cannot govern and workers organize alternative power. Fifth, insurrection overthrows the old state. Sixth, revolutionary transformation of economic relations begins. The Paris Commune of 1871 provided Marx with a concrete example of workers' power. For 2 months, workers governed Paris through elected councils. They implemented progressive measures, separating church and state, limiting official salaries, worker control of abandoned factories. Though brutally crushed, the Commune demonstrated that workers could govern and pointed toward new political forms. Marx concluded that workers could not simply seize the existing state apparatus and use it for their purposes. The capitalist state is organized to maintain capitalist rule. Its bureaucracy, military, and police serve ruling class interests. Revolution requires not just taking state power, but smashing the old state and building new institutions of workers' power. This became a key point of contention within Marxism. The question of violence troubled and troubles many. Marx recognized that ruling classes do not relinquish power voluntarily. They use state violence, legal repression, and extra state force to maintain dominance. Revolution would likely involve violence because the ruling class would resist with violence. But Marx did not fetishize violence or see it as intrinsically revolutionary. Violence was unfortunate but probably necessary given ruling class intransigence. He also acknowledged that in some circumstances, particularly in democratic countries like England or America, peaceful transition might be possible. If workers gained sufficient electoral strength and the ruling class accepted democratic outcomes, violence might be avoided. But he was skeptical this would occur. Historical experience suggested ruling classes resort to force when threatened, subverting democratic procedures to maintain power. The international character of revolution was crucial for Marx. Capitalism was becoming a world system. National economies were increasingly interconnected. Revolution in one country would face intervention from capitalist powers. Workers of different countries had more in common with each other than with their national bourgeoisies. International solidarity was both practically necessary and theoretically correct. Workers have no country. The phrase "workers of the world unite" was not rhetorical flourish but strategic necessity. Yet revolution would likely begin unevenly, in the weakest links of the capitalist chain. Countries with acute contradictions might explode first, even if not the most developed. Revolution in one country could inspire others, creating a revolutionary wave. International coordination of workers' movements could support revolutions and prevent isolated defeats. The revolutionary process would be international, even if beginning nationally. Marx distinguished revolution from coups or simple changes of government. Revolution involves fundamental transformation of property relations and class structure. It means workers collectively seizing means of production and reorganizing the economy. It requires creating new political institutions through which workers govern. It transforms legal systems, cultural institutions, and social relations. Revolution is total social transformation, not just political change. The goal of revolution is not reversing class positions, making workers into the new exploiters. Revolution aims to abolish class itself by ending private ownership of means of production. When workers collectively own and control production, organized to meet social needs rather than private profit, class distinctions based on property disappear. Revolution means transcending class society, not perpetuating it with new rulers. Critics argue that revolution is dangerous, destructive, and likely to produce tyranny rather than liberation. Historical experience, particularly in the Soviet Union and China, suggests revolutionary seizures of power lead to bureaucratic dictatorships, not workers' democracy. Gradual reform within democratic capitalism seems safer and more effective than violent upheaval. Defenders respond that reform has not eliminated exploitation or capitalism's fundamental irrationalities, that the violence of revolution must be compared to the ongoing violence of capitalism: starvation amid plenty, preventable disease, workplace deaths, imperialist wars. That revolutionary failures resulted from specific historical circumstances, isolation, underdevelopment, not inherent flaws in revolutionary aims. That the alternative to revolutionary transformation is perpetual exploitation and periodic catastrophic crises. The debate continues. Contemporary movements face the same question: reform or revolution? Can capitalism be sufficiently reformed, or must it be overthrown? Can gradual changes accumulate into fundamental transformation, or do they strengthen the system by making it more tolerable? Can electoral politics achieve working class power, or does the capitalist state serve necessarily to block such transformation? Marx's legacy is insisting that these questions be confronted directly. He argued that understanding capitalism's dynamics reveals both its unsustainability and the necessity of conscious political action to transform it. Contradictions create possibilities but not guarantees. Revolution requires objective conditions and subjective readiness, material circumstances, and organized agency. The working class has potential to be a revolutionary force, but realizing that potential requires struggle, organization, consciousness, and strategic clarity about what transformation means and requires. The dictatorship of the proletariat, transition to communism. Few of Marx's concepts have generated more controversy than the dictatorship of the proletariat. The phrase sounds ominous, conjuring images of totalitarian states and violent repression. Yet Marx used it to describe a necessary transitional period between capitalism and communism, a phase where workers hold political power and use it to transform economic relations. Understanding what Marx actually meant is essential to grasping his vision of revolutionary transformation. The term dictatorship did not have the same connotations in Marx's time that it has today. It referred to the exercise of political power by one class over others, not necessarily to personal despotism or totalitarian control. In this sense, capitalism itself is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The capitalist class controls state power, using it to protect property rights, enforce contracts, suppress resistance, and maintain conditions for accumulation. Democracy coexists with class dictatorship. The dictatorship of the proletariat simply means workers holding political power and using it to suppress capitalist resistance to social transformation. Just as capitalists use state power to establish and defend capitalism against feudal remnants and popular challenges, workers must use state power to establish socialism against capitalist resistance. The difference is that workers are the majority, so their dictatorship is more democratic than minority capitalist rule. Marx developed this concept partly through studying the Paris Commune of 1871. For 2 months, Parisian workers established their own government through elected councils. Officials were recallable and paid workers' wages. The standing army was replaced with armed citizens. The Commune separated church and state, limited working hours, and began worker control of production. Though crushed brutally, it demonstrated workers' capacity for self-government. Marx saw the Commune as embodying the dictatorship of the proletariat in practice. It was not a dictatorship in the sense of one-person rule, but a democratic form through which workers collectively exercised power. Its failures came not from too much democracy, but from not going far enough, not expropriating banks, not marching on Versailles, not sufficiently securing power against reaction. The dictatorship of the proletariat has specific tasks. First, it must expropriate the capitalist class, transferring ownership of means of production to social ownership. Factories, land, banks, major industries would become collectively owned. This expropriation would be resisted by capitalists using whatever means available, hence the need for workers to control state power to carry it through. Second, it must reorganize production. Instead of producing for profit, production would be organized to meet social needs. Planning would replace market anarchy. Workers would control their workplaces. Distribution would begin to shift from market exchange toward allocation based on need. This transformation requires conscious direction, not just spontaneous development. Third, it must defend the revolution against internal and external enemies. Capitalists will attempt sabotage, counter-revolution, foreign intervention. The workers' state must suppress these threats while encouraging international revolution. This defensive function is why some coercion is necessary in the transition period. Fourth, it must transform social relations beyond the economic. Education must be reorganized to serve collective development rather than class reproduction. Cultural production must shift from commodity form toward genuine creativity. Gender relations must be liberated from patriarchal patterns. The entire complex of social relations must be revolutionized. Fifth, it must begin creating conditions for its own disappearance. The state exists to manage class conflict. In a classless society, the state as an instrument of class rule becomes unnecessary. The dictatorship of the proletariat must progressively reduce inequality, develop productive forces, spread education and culture, and create conditions where coercive state power becomes obsolete. Marx distinguished this from both anarchism and social democracy. Anarchists wanted to abolish the state immediately after revolution. Marx argued this was utopian. Capitalist resistance requires state power to suppress it. Production must be coordinated, which requires administrative functions. The state cannot simply be abolished, but must be transformed and eventually wither away as class distinctions disappear. Social democrats believed socialism could be achieved through gradual parliamentary reforms within the existing state. Marx argued the capitalist state serves capitalist interests structurally. Its bureaucracy, military, and legal system are organized to maintain capitalist rule. Workers cannot simply take control of this apparatus, but must smash it and build new institutions of workers' democracy. The dictatorship of the proletariat is transitional precisely because it maintains features of the old society while building the new. Class distinctions persist initially. Some inequality remains. Distribution follows the principle of contribution, from each according to ability to each according to work. Money and commodity exchange continue in modified forms. The state still exists. Only gradually are these vestiges overcome. This transition period Marx sometimes called the lower phase of communism or socialism. It differs from capitalism in that means of production are socially owned and production is planned for needs rather than profit. But it differs from full communism in that scarcity, inequality, and state power persist. It is a hybrid form containing elements of both the society emerging from and the society being created. The length of this transition cannot be predetermined. It depends on material conditions, level of productive development, extent of capitalist resistance, success of international revolution, cultural transformation. Marx did not imagine it would be quick or easy. Transforming economic relations and social consciousness is generational work. How democratic would this dictatorship be? Marx envisioned workers' councils or communes as basic units of governance. Delegates would be elected, recallable, and paid workers' wages. Bureaucracy would be minimized. Administration of things would replace government of people. Workers would govern themselves collectively rather than being governed by separate state apparatus. But Marx was vague on institutional details. He did not provide blueprints for the workers' state. He emphasized that workers would create appropriate forms through revolutionary practice, not follow predetermined plans. The Paris Commune suggested possibilities but was too brief to fully develop them. Later, theorists and revolutionaries would elaborate various models, often conflicting. Historical attempts at proletarian dictatorship raise profound questions. The Soviet Union claimed to embody this concept but developed into bureaucratic dictatorship with minimal workers' control. China's Communist Party maintained one-party rule while gradually reintroducing capitalism. Other revolutionary states showed similar patterns: concentration of power, suppression of dissent, emergence of privileged bureaucracies. Defenders argue these outcomes reflected specific historical circumstances: isolation, underdevelopment, imperialist encirclement, not inherent flaws in the concept. The Soviet Union faced civil war, foreign intervention, and economic devastation. China was desperately poor and primarily peasant. Revolutionary democracy was sacrificed to survival needs and later bureaucratized. Critics contend the concept itself is flawed. Concentrating power to suppress capitalism creates bureaucracies that resist democratization. Using state power to transform society from above contradicts self-emancipation. The transition becomes permanent, with ruling parties substituting for working-class power. The dictatorship of the proletariat becomes dictatorship over the proletariat. The debate involves fundamental questions about means and ends. Can coercive power create a free society? Can minority vanguards represent majority interests? Can centralized planning genuinely serve social needs? Can state power wither away if strengthened initially? Historical experience suggests dangers in concentrating power even in revolutionary hands. Alternative models have been proposed. Council communism emphasized workers' councils over party dictatorship. Libertarian socialists advocated federal structures and workers' self-management. Democratic socialists sought to combine electoral democracy with social ownership. Each attempted to avoid concentrating power while achieving economic transformation. Marx himself provided limited guidance for these debates because he died before seeing sustained attempts at proletarian rule. His concept remained somewhat abstract, emphasizing the need for workers' political power and economic transformation without detailing institutional mechanisms. This left space for vastly different interpretations and practices. What remains clear is Marx's insistence that political transformation must serve economic transformation. Seizing state power is necessary but insufficient. The point is reorganizing production, abolishing class, creating material basis for genuine freedom. The worker state is instrumental, a tool for social transformation, not an end in itself. Its success is measured by progress toward classless society, not by its own perpetuation. The dictatorship of the proletariat also must be understood internationally. Isolated worker states face tremendous pressures: economic blockade, military threat, inability to fully develop production. Marx expected revolution to spread, with worker states supporting each other and coordinating transformation. The failure of international revolution left attempted socialist states isolated and vulnerable, contributing to bureaucratization and eventual restoration of capitalism. Whether the concept remains useful today is contested. Some argue historical failures discredit it entirely, that any concentration of power in transition produces tyranny. Others maintain the core insight that workers need political power to transform capitalism remains valid, though institutional forms must be radically democratic to avoid bureaucratic degeneration. Still others see it as outdated, replaced by more sophisticated theories of social transformation. The enduring question is how to transform capitalism without reproducing domination in new forms, how to organize collective power without creating new ruling classes, how to defend revolution without sacrificing democracy, how to use state power while preparing its transcendence. Marx identified the problem and pointed toward solutions but left many questions unanswered. His successors continue struggling with these challenges, seeking ways to realize the vision of workers' self-emancipation through collective democratic power used to create a classless society. Marx versus religion, opium of the people. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. This famous passage from Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right is often quoted but rarely understood in its full context. Marx's critique of religion was neither simple atheist dismissal nor crude materialism. It was a profound analysis of how religion functions in class society and why it persists despite its illusory character. Marx approached religion as a social phenomenon requiring explanation. Why do people believe in gods and afterlives? Why do religious institutions wield such power? Why does religion persist across millennia and diverse cultures? His answer was that religion arises from real social conditions and serves real social functions, even while expressing illusions about the world. The foundation of Marx's critique came from Ludwig Feuerbach, who argued that religion is a projection of human nature onto an imaginary divine being. Humans create God in their own image, attributing to this deity the qualities they value: love, justice, wisdom, power. They then worship this projection, alienating their own human essence. Theology is actually anthropology in disguise. God is humanity alienated from itself. Marx accepted this critique but found it insufficient. Feuerbach explained the psychological mechanism of religious projection, but not why people engage in such projection. He described religion as illusion, but not why illusions are necessary or appealing. Marx argued that religion must be understood in its social and historical context. It arises from and responds to specific material conditions. Religion reflects the suffering of the oppressed and is simultaneously a protest against that suffering and a mechanism for tolerating it. People turn to religion because their actual conditions are unbearable. They seek meaning, justice, and consolation that reality denies them. Religion provides these things, but in imaginary form. It promises justice in heaven rather than demanding it on earth. It offers spiritual comfort rather than material transformation. It is opium, a painkiller that dulls suffering without addressing causes. This is why Marx called the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition which requires illusions. Religion is both symptom and treatment of social disease. Eliminating religion requires eliminating the conditions that make it necessary. Marx distinguished his critique from simple anti-theism. The criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. Religion must be understood before other social forms because it is the most comprehensive expression of human alienation in its abstract form. But attacking religion alone accomplishes nothing. The critique must extend to the earthly forms that produce religious consciousness. Throughout history, ruling classes used religion to justify their dominance. Ancient empires claimed divine sanction for royal power. Medieval Christianity taught that social hierarchy reflected God's plan. Kings ruled by divine right. Suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Obedience to earthly masters pleased God. Religion functioned as ideology, making exploitation seem natural and inevitable. The church was also a direct economic power in many societies. In feudal Europe, the Catholic Church was among the largest landowners, extracting wealth through tithes and land rents. Monasteries operated as economic enterprises. The church hierarchy lived in luxury while preaching poverty to the masses. Religious institutions directly participated in exploitation while providing spiritual justification for it. Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, developed alongside early capitalism. Max Weber later elaborated how Protestant ethics contributed to capitalist development. The emphasis on individual responsibility, hard work, worldly success as sign of grace, and systematic organization of life aligned with capitalist requirements. Religious transformation reflected and facilitated economic transformation. But Marx did not see religion as simply a tool cynically wielded by rulers. It also provided genuine comfort and community for the oppressed. Religious gatherings offered social connection. Rituals marked life transitions and created meaning. Beliefs in divine justice provided hope when earthly justice was absent. Religion met real human needs, even while distracting from their material sources. This is why Marx opposed crude materialist atheism that simply mocked religious believers. Religion would not disappear through rational argument or ridicule. It would persist as long as the conditions producing it persisted. Only transforming society to eliminate suffering and alienation would make religion unnecessary. When people controlled their own lives and society, when material conditions provided security and meaning, religious consolation would become superfluous. Marx analyzed how religion mystifies social relations. It presents socially produced suffering as natural or divinely ordained. Poverty becomes God's will rather than result of exploitation. Social hierarchy becomes divine plan rather than human construction. Religion naturalizes what is actually historical and changeable. It eternizes what is temporal and transformable. Religious consciousness also inverts real relationships. Humans create God, but religious consciousness believes God created humans. Humans create moral values, but religion claims values come from divine commandment. The human origin of religious ideas is forgotten, and they appear as external truths. This parallels how capitalism produces commodity fetishism, where social relations appear as relations between things. Yet religion contains utopian elements. Religious visions of heaven, paradise, or the kingdom of God express genuine human aspirations for a better world. The prophetic tradition in Judaism and Christianity often criticized injustice and envisioned radical transformation. Liberation theology later developed explicitly revolutionary interpretations of Christianity. Religion can inspire resistance even while usually counseling acceptance. Marx distinguished between religion's form and content. The form, belief in supernatural entities and divine providence, is illusory. But the content, the aspirations for justice, community, and meaning, reflects real human needs. Communist society would fulfill these needs materially rather than imaginarily. It would be a world where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, realizing religion's unfulfilled promises without supernatural beliefs. The socialist movement's relationship with religion has been complex. Some socialists embraced militant atheism, seeing religion as necessarily reactionary. Others sought alliances with progressive religious movements. Still others argued religious beliefs are private matters irrelevant to political struggle. Marx suggested that while religion would eventually disappear in communist society, socialists should focus on transforming material conditions rather than religious beliefs directly. Historical socialist movements took varying approaches. The Soviet Union promoted state atheism, closing churches, and persecuting believers. This often backfired, making religion a form of resistance to state power. China's Cultural Revolution attacked religious institutions violently. Other socialist movements, particularly in Latin America, allied with liberation theology and progressive Christianity. The most effective approach remains debated. Marx's critique of religion also applies to secular ideologies that function similarly. Nationalism, for instance, creates imaginary communities that obscure class divisions. People identify with national interests that actually serve ruling classes. The nation is worshipped, and sacrifices are demanded in its name. Secular religions of the market, progress, or technology promise salvation through belief in impersonal forces. These function like traditional religion, demanding faith and obscuring material interests. Contemporary capitalism shows religion's persistence and adaptation. In some regions, religious fundamentalism grows alongside capitalism's penetration. People turn to religious certainty amid economic disruption and social dislocation. Religious institutions provide community and identity where market relations atomize individuals. Evangelical prosperity gospel blends perfectly with capitalist ideology, treating wealth as divine blessing and poverty as personal failing. Yet secularization also continues, particularly in developed capitalist countries. Church attendance declines, religious authority weakens. For many, consumer culture replaces religious practice as source of meaning and identity. But this does not necessarily mean liberation. Commodity fetishism becomes the new opiate, offering fulfillment through consumption rather than spiritual salvation. Critics argue Marx was too dismissive of religion's positive roles. Religious communities provide solidarity and mutual aid. Religious ethics can motivate progressive action. Many religious people participated in socialist and revolutionary movements. Reducing religion to opiate ignores its complexity and diversity. Liberation theology demonstrates religion can be radical rather than conservative. Defenders respond that Marx recognized religion's complexity, calling it both protest and opiate. His critique targeted religion's function in class society, not individual believers' sincerity. He argued that religion would become unnecessary in classless society, not that religious people cannot be revolutionaries. The key point remains that religious consciousness arises from alienation and cannot be eliminated without transforming material conditions producing alienation. The question of religion's future in socialism remains open. Would religion genuinely disappear in a classless society without suffering and exploitation? Or do existential questions about meaning, death, and mystery ensure religion's persistence regardless of social organization? Marx believed religion would fade as people gained control over their lives and societies, but he provided no timetable or mechanism beyond general social transformation. What remains clear is Marx's insistence that religion must be understood materially rather than purely ideologically. Religious beliefs and institutions arise from specific social conditions and serve specific social functions. They change as those conditions change. They cannot be eliminated through argument alone, but only through transforming the world that produces them. The critique of religion is prerequisite to broader social critique, but it must extend to criticizing and transforming the earthly conditions that make heavenly consolation necessary. Communism, the classless society. Marx spent most of his intellectual life analyzing capitalism. His published work contains exhaustive detail about commodity production, value formation, capital accumulation. Yet he wrote remarkably little about communism, the society that would replace capitalism. This was deliberate. Marx refused to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. He believed socialists should focus on understanding the present and organizing to overthrow it, not constructing detailed blueprints for an unknown future. Still, scattered throughout his work are hints and suggestions about what communist society might look like. Communism represents the positive transcendence of private property and therefore of human self-estrangement. It is not simply another economic system, but the resolution of contradictions that have defined human history. Class society in all its forms, from ancient slavery through feudalism to capitalism, involves some people exploiting others' labor. Communism would be the first mode of social organization without systematic exploitation, the first genuinely human society. The economic foundation of communism is social ownership of the means of production. Factories, land, machinery, resources would belong to society collectively rather than private individuals. This does not mean state ownership necessarily, which can become a new form of class rule if bureaucracy controls the state. True social ownership means democratic control by associated producers, workers collectively managing production. Production would be organized consciously to meet human needs rather than following market imperatives. Instead of anarchy of production coordinated ex post through market exchange, planning would determine what to produce, how much, using what methods. This planning would be democratic, involving workers and communities in decisions about production and distribution, not imposed by central bureaucracy. The principle governing distribution would evolve through stages. Initially, in what Marx called the lower phase of communism or socialism, distribution would follow contribution, from each according to ability to each according to work. Workers would receive compensation based on labor contributed. Inequality would persist because people's abilities differ, but exploitation would be eliminated because workers would receive the full value of their product minus deductions for social needs. Eventually, in the higher phase of communism, distribution would follow the principle from each according to ability to each according to need. Material abundance and transformed consciousness would make this possible. Productive forces would develop sufficiently that scarcity no longer dominated social life. People would work not from compulsion, but as life's prime want. They would take what they needed without calculating contribution. The realm of freedom would begin. Labor itself would transform fundamentally. Under capitalism, work is alienated, something to be endured for wages. In communism, labor would become genuine self-expression. The division between mental and manual labor would break down. Workers would develop multiple capacities rather than being confined to narrow specialization. As Marx wrote in the German Ideology, it would be possible to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This is not literally about occupational multiplicity, but about ending the alienating division of labor that confines people to single roles. Under capitalism, division of labor develops productive forces, but imprisons individuals in narrow functions. In communism, social organization would permit all-around development of human capacities. Education would be universal and comprehensive. Work would rotate to prevent crystallization into fixed roles. People would be polymorphous rather than specialized. The state would wither away. State power exists to manage class conflict. In classless society, no class requires suppression. Administrative functions remain, coordinating production and managing resources, but these would not constitute a state in the political sense. There would be administration of things rather than government of persons. Coercive political authority would become obsolete. Similarly, law would transform. Legal systems exist primarily to protect property and regulate conflicts arising from private interest. In communist society based on cooperation and abundance, many legal functions would become unnecessary. Disputes would be resolved through discussion and democratic decision rather than formal legal processes. The distinction between public and private would blur as social life became genuinely communal. Family structures would change profoundly. The bourgeois family is based on capital and private gain. Women are treated as property. Children are exploited. Marriage is prostitution thinly veiled. Communism would abolish this family form, replacing it with voluntary associations based on genuine affection rather than economic necessity. Gender equality would be real rather than formal. Child rearing would become social responsibility rather than private burden. Culture and education would flourish. Instead of being commodified and serving class rule, they would become genuine expressions of human creativity and development. Art would not be produced for profit, but as intrinsic activity. Education would develop capacities rather than training workers. Scientific research would serve human needs rather than capital accumulation. Cultural production would be democratized, with everyone able to participate rather than culture being monopolized by specialists. The relationship with nature would transform. Capitalism exploits nature as it exploits labor, treating the natural world as mere resource for accumulation. Communism would establish sustainable metabolic relationship with nature. Production would respect ecological limits. Technology would serve to lighten labor and minimize environmental impact. Humans would consciously regulate their interaction with nature rather than being dominated by blind economic forces. Cities and countryside would blur. Capitalism concentrates people in enormous urban centers while leaving rural areas underdeveloped. This division reflects and reinforces class structure. Communism would integrate urban and rural life, using technology to make countryside pleasant and productive while preventing urban overcrowding. Population would be distributed more evenly across territory. International divisions would disappear. Capitalism creates national competition and imperialism. Communism would be international from the start. Nations as political entities would lose significance as class divisions disappeared. Linguistic and cultural diversity would persist, but not organized into competitive nation-states. Humanity would be united in cooperative commonwealth rather than divided into rival powers. How would this transformation occur? Not through decree or plan imposed from above, but through revolutionary transformation of property relations, followed by gradual development of productive forces and transformation of consciousness. The working class would seize political power, expropriate capital, reorganize production. Initially, elements of the old society would persist: inequality, scarcity, necessity of state power. Only gradually would genuinely communist social relations develop. Marx insisted he was describing scientific socialism rather than utopian socialism. Utopians designed ideal societies based on reason and justice, believing they could be implemented through education and example. Marx argued communism must emerge from capitalism's contradictions through working-class revolution. It could not be designed in advance, but would develop through practical experience of organizing production democratically. This explains his reluctance to provide detail. The forms communism would take depend on specific historical circumstances, level of productive development, cultural traditions. Workers liberating themselves would create appropriate institutions through practice. Intellectuals could not and should not design these in advance. The most Marx would say is that certain general features would characterize any genuinely communist society. Critics raise numerous objections. First, human nature makes communism impossible. People are selfish, competitive, need material incentives. Without private property and markets, productivity would collapse. Second, economic calculation is impossible without markets. Central planning has proven inefficient. Third, eliminating the state invites chaos. Society requires authority to function. Fourth, abolishing family destroys basic human institution. Fifth, historical attempts at communism produce tyranny and poverty, not freedom and abundance. Defenders respond that human nature is historically shaped, not fixed. Capitalism produces competitive individualism, but humans are capable of cooperation and solidarity. That economic calculation without markets is possible through democratic planning using information technology unavailable in Marx's time. That eliminating coercive state power differs from eliminating all coordination. That transforming family does not mean abolishing intimate relationships. That historical failures reflected specific circumstances and deviations from Marx's vision rather than inherent flaws. The debate ultimately involves differing assessments of human possibility. Is genuine cooperation achievable or utopian fantasy? Can production be organized democratically, or does complexity require hierarchy? Can abundance overcome scarcity, or are resources inherently limited? Can consciousness transform sufficiently, or are competitive instincts ineradicable? These questions cannot be resolved theoretically, but only through historical practice. What remains from Marx's vision is the insistence that capitalism is not eternal, that alternatives are possible, that human beings can consciously organize society to meet needs rather than being dominated by blind economic forces. Whether the specific features Marx suggested are viable or desirable can be debated, but the fundamental claim that a classless, cooperative society is both necessary and possible continues to inspire those dissatisfied with capitalism's inequalities and irrationalities. Communism in Marx's sense is not forced equality or totalitarian control, but the actualization of human freedom. It is people collectively controlling their social life rather than being controlled by forces of their own making. It is production for use rather than profit. It is cooperation replacing competition. It is the end of exploitation and beginning of genuinely human history. Whether this vision can be realized remains the great question Marx posed but could not answer. Only future generations, through their struggles, can determine whether communism is dream or destiny. Marx's legacy from theory to practice. Karl Marx died in 1883, known to few outside socialist circles. Within decades, movements claiming his name had millions of followers. By the mid-20th century, governments ruling over one-third of humanity declared themselves Marxist. His ideas shaped revolutions, inspired social movements, and influenced academic disciplines. Yet this legacy is profoundly contested. Did these movements realize Marx's vision or betray it? Does historical experience validate or refute his analysis? The first major test came in Russia. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the world's largest country. They claimed to be establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat and building socialism. Yet Russia contradicted Marx's expectations. It was not an advanced capitalist country, but predominantly peasant and relatively undeveloped. Marx expected revolution where productive forces were highest. Russia was far from this. Lenin argued that imperialism created uneven development, making the weakest link in the capitalist chain likely to break first. Revolution in backward Russia could spark revolution in advanced countries, particularly Germany. International revolution would then support Russian development. This seemed plausible in 1917 to 1919 as revolutionary upheavals swept Europe. But the German Revolution failed. Russia remained isolated. Isolation profoundly shaped Soviet development. The Bolsheviks faced civil war, foreign intervention, economic collapse. They implemented war communism, nationalizing industry and requisitioning grain. The economy imploded. Lenin retreated with the new economic policy, allowing market relations while maintaining state control of commanding heights. This worked economically, but created political tensions. Joseph Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s and launched forced collectivization and rapid industrialization. Millions died in resulting famines. The state became totalitarian, crushing dissent and establishing labor camps. Industry developed rapidly, but at terrible human cost. By Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union was an industrial and military superpower ruled by a brutal bureaucracy. Was this socialism? Defenders pointed to state ownership, economic planning, guaranteed employment, universal education and healthcare, elimination of capitalist class. Critics noted absence of workers' control, political dictatorship, persistence of inequality and exploitation through state apparatus, lack of democratic planning. The debate continues. Deformed workers' state or state capitalism, or a new mode of production entirely? China's revolution in 1949 followed a different path. Mao Zedong led a peasant army to power after decades of civil war and Japanese occupation. The Communist Party claimed Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, but adapted it to Chinese conditions. Land reform and collectivization transformed the countryside. Industry was nationalized, but political control remained with the party, not workers' councils. Mao launched radical campaigns. The Great Leap Forward attempting rapid industrialization through mass mobilization, resulting in catastrophic famine. The Cultural Revolution attacking bureaucracy and traditional culture, producing chaos and repression. After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms while maintaining party control. Today, China combines authoritarian one-party rule with extensive capitalism, claiming to be building socialism with Chinese characteristics. Cuba's revolution in 1959 brought Fidel Castro to power, initially without explicit Marxism. Facing U.S. hostility and seeking Soviet support, Castro declared the revolution socialist. Cuba nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, provided universal health care and education. It survived U.S. embargo and Soviet collapse, but it remained politically authoritarian, economically struggling, dependent on subsidies and tourism. Is this socialism or survival strategy? These major revolutionary states claimed Marx's legacy but developed in ways he did not anticipate. All involved Communist Party rule rather than workers' councils. All maintained or developed significant inequality. All relied on state ownership rather than democratic worker control. All faced hostility from capitalist powers, contributing to authoritarian development. Whether they represent socialism or betrayals thereof remains debated. Beyond revolutionary states, Marxist ideas influenced social democratic and labor movements in capitalist countries. Parties claiming Marxist heritage won elections in many nations. Some implemented significant reforms, nationalized industries, welfare states, labor protections, universal healthcare. But they accepted capitalism's fundamental framework, pursuing redistribution rather than transformation. The debate between revolutionary and reformist socialism dominated 20th century left politics. Revolutionaries argued reforms would be reversed without abolishing capitalism, pointing to erosion of welfare states since the 1980s. Reformists contended revolution led to dictatorship, not liberation, and gradual change was more effective and humane. The split weakened working-class movements worldwide. Marx's economic analysis also influenced broader academic discourse. Labor theory of value, analysis of accumulation and crisis, understanding of ideology shaped sociology, political economy, history. Many rejected Marx's politics while finding his analysis useful for understanding capitalism. Others developed non-Marxist critiques of capitalism drawing on his insights. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 seemed to many to vindicate capitalism and refute Marx. Revolutionary socialism had failed, producing sclerotic economies and oppressive states. Capitalism triumphed, spreading globally. Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history, liberal capitalism's permanent victory. Marx's ideas seemed obsolete, relics of failed experiments. Yet capitalism's problems persisted. Inequality widened dramatically. Financial crises recurred with increasing severity, culminating in 2008's global meltdown. Ecological crisis intensified as climate change threatened planetary catastrophe. Precarious work spread as unions declined. The promised prosperity and freedom failed to materialize for most people. This created renewed interest in Marx. If capitalism was triumphant, why did crises multiply? Why did inequality increase? Why did ecological destruction accelerate? Marx's analysis of capitalism's contradictions, exploitation, and crisis tendencies seemed relevant again. Young people facing declining prospects turned to socialist ideas. Movements like Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders' campaigns drew explicitly on class analysis. Academic Marxism also revived after decades of marginalization. Scholars returned to Marx's texts, developing sophisticated analyses of contemporary capitalism. Autonomous Marxism emphasized workers' power and self-activity. Analytical Marxism applied rational choice theory to Marxist questions. Post-Marxism combined Marx with post-structuralism. These developments showed Marx's continued intellectual vitality. Feminist scholars engaged Marx critically and productively. They noted his neglect of unpaid domestic labor, primarily women's work. They showed how capitalism relies on unpaid reproductive labor while exploiting wage labor. Social reproduction theory synthesized Marxism and feminism, analyzing how capital accumulates through exploitation of both productive and reproductive labor. This extended and enriched Marxist analysis. Ecological Marxism addressed environmental crisis through Marxist frameworks. Capitalism's growth imperative drives resource depletion and environmental destruction. The metabolic rift between human society and nature intensifies under capitalism. Eco-socialism emerged, arguing that solving ecological crisis requires transcending capitalism, combining Marx's critique with ecological consciousness. Post-colonial theorists criticized Marx's Eurocentrism and engagement with imperialism. They noted his sometimes dismissive comments about non-European societies and his ambivalence about colonialism's progressive role. Yet they also drew on his analysis of capital accumulation and exploitation to understand imperialism and underdevelopment. Dependency theory and world systems analysis extended Marx's analysis globally. Critical race theory engaged Marx while noting his insufficient attention to race and racism. Capitalism certainly exploits racial divisions, but race is not reducible to class. Racial capitalism, theorists argue, is a specific historical formation where race and class intersect. This extends rather than rejects Marxist analysis, showing how capitalism utilizes and produces racial hierarchies. Contemporary movements show Marx's continued influence. Labor organizing, anti-austerity protests, housing movements, campaigns for universal healthcare all draw on class analysis and critique of capitalism. Democratic socialist organizations grow, advocating public ownership and democratic planning. These movements face the old question, reform or revolution? Can capitalism be sufficiently transformed from within, or must it be overthrown? Technology creates new questions for Marxism. Does automation vindicate Marx's prediction that capitalism would eliminate the labor it depends on? Do platform companies like Uber and Amazon represent new forms of exploitation or fundamentally different modes of production? Does digital technology enable democratic planning or intensify surveillance and control? These questions require extending Marx's analysis to new conditions. The legacy is contradictory. Movements invoking Marx liberated millions from colonial rule and feudal oppression. They also built authoritarian states that oppressed their own populations. They achieved genuine advances in healthcare, education, and equality. They also produced bureaucratic nightmares, economic stagnation, and political repression. Can we separate the insights from the catastrophes, the liberatory vision from the authoritarian practice? Marx would likely argue that historical failures do not refute the theory, but show the difficulty of revolutionary transformation. He never claimed revolution would be easy or automatic. He emphasized that people make history under circumstances not of their choosing. Revolutionary movements faced hostile international environments, material scarcity, bureaucratic degeneration. These concrete problems do not invalidate the critique of capitalism or vision of alternatives. The question remains, can Marx's vision of democratic, cooperative, classless society be realized? Or do attempts inevitably produce tyranny and failure? Historical experience suggests both dangers and possibilities. The Russian and Chinese revolutions showed workers could seize power and transform societies, but also how isolation, underdevelopment, and bureaucratization could produce outcomes far from Marx's vision. Social democracy showed reforms could improve workers' lives within capitalism, but also how such gains could be reversed when capital regained confidence. Perhaps the key lesson is that Marx provided tools for analyzing capitalism, not a blueprint for replacing it. His critique of exploitation, his understanding of crises, his vision of cooperative production remain valuable. But the specific forms of organization, the strategies for transformation, the institutions of a post-capitalist society must be developed through practice, not deduced from texts. Marx's legacy is a critical method and revolutionary commitment, not a finished program. Whether this legacy leads toward liberation or new forms of domination depends on how future generations interpret and apply it in their struggles for a better world. Modern relevance, Marx in the 21st century. More than a century and a half after Marx published Capital, his analysis seems remarkably prescient. The world of 2025 looks in many ways like Marx's descriptions and predictions. Extreme inequality concentrates wealth in fewer hands. Financial crises shake the global economy with increasing frequency. Work becomes more precarious and alienating. Environmental destruction accelerates. Technology displaces workers while profits soar. The contradictions Marx identified have not disappeared but intensified on a global scale. Consider inequality. Marx predicted that capital accumulation would concentrate wealth at one pole and poverty at another. Contemporary data confirms this starkly. The richest 1% now own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. 8 individuals possess wealth equal to half of humanity. CEO compensation is 300 times average worker pay compared to 20 times in the 1960s. This is not aberration but follows from capitalism's logic. Those owning capital accumulate while those selling labor struggle. The mechanisms Marx analyzed explain this. Surplus value extraction continues. Workers produce more value than they receive as wages. Productivity increases, but gains go to capital rather than labor. Wages stagnate while profits rise. Technology allows capital to produce more with less labor, reducing workers' bargaining power. Globalization creates competition among workers worldwide, driving wages toward minimum sustainable levels. The tendencies Marx identified operate with intensified force. Financial crises recur with disturbing regularity. The 2008 global financial crisis was the most severe since the Great Depression, wiping out trillions in wealth, destroying millions of jobs, triggering a foreclosure crisis. Recovery has been slow and uneven, with many workers never regaining pre-crisis living standards. Subsequent crises in Europe, emerging markets, and pandemic-related disruptions continue the pattern. These are not accidents but manifestations of capitalism's contradictory dynamics. Marx's analysis of overproduction and crisis explains this. Capitalists invest to maximize profit, expanding production without coordination. They compete to reduce costs, suppressing wages. But wages are also source of demand. Production expands while purchasing power contracts. Overproduction relative to profitable demand becomes inevitable. Financial speculation amplifies these tendencies, creating bubbles that eventually burst. The system lurches from boom to crisis to recovery to new boom and crisis. Work has become increasingly precarious and alienating, exactly as Marx described. The gig economy turns millions into supposedly independent contractors with no benefits, no security, no union protection. Workers drive for Uber, deliver for DoorDash, complete tasks on Amazon Mechanical Turk, all without employment rights. This is not liberation, but intensified exploitation. Workers bear all risks while companies extract profits without responsibility. Technology intensifies alienation in new forms. Algorithms monitor workers with unprecedented precision, tracking every movement, timing every task, evaluating performance continuously. Warehouse workers wear devices measuring productivity. Call center workers follow scripts generated by software. White-collar workers face constant email, endless meetings, surveillance through company systems. The boundary between work and life dissolves as technology enables round-the-clock availability. Alienation becomes total. Automation threatens displacement on massive scale. Self-driving vehicles could eliminate millions of transportation jobs. Artificial intelligence replaces accountants, lawyers, radiologists. Manufacturing requires fewer workers as robots become more capable. Marx predicted this. Capital replaces living labor with machinery, reducing the source of surplus value while displacing workers. The contradiction intensifies as technology becomes more sophisticated. Yet profits from automation do not benefit society broadly. They concentrate in corporate coffers and shareholder returns. Workers displaced by technology face unemployment or worse jobs. The social wealth produced by accumulated knowledge and technology is appropriated privately. This vindication of Marx's insight, socialized production, private appropriation. Technology could liberate humanity from drudgery, but under capitalism, it creates unemployment and insecurity instead. Environmental crisis reveals capitalism's fundamental irrationality. Climate change threatens catastrophic consequences: rising seas, extreme weather, ecosystem collapse, mass migration. The science is clear, solutions exist, yet action remains inadequate because addressing climate change conflicts with profit imperatives. Fossil fuel companies protect investments. Industries resist regulation. Short-term profit trumps long-term survival. Marx analyzed capitalism's metabolic rift with nature. Capitalist agriculture exhausts soil. Industrial production pollutes air and water. The system treats nature as infinite resource and infinite sink, both false. Ecological limits conflict with capitalism's growth imperative. Profit requires endless accumulation, but the planet is finite. This contradiction cannot be resolved within capitalism because growth is not optional but necessary for the system's functioning. Proposed solutions like green capitalism or carbon markets fail to address fundamental dynamics. They attempt to make environmental destruction profitable to prevent it, a contradiction. Real solutions require ending growth imperative, democratizing production decisions, prioritizing sustainability over profit. This means transcending capitalism, as eco-socialists argue. Climate crisis vindicates Marx's insight that capitalism cannot rationally regulate its relationship with nature. Globalization has proceeded exactly as Marx anticipated. Capital flows globally seeking lowest costs and highest profits. Production chains span continents. Workers worldwide compete against each other. Race to the bottom drives wages down and working conditions toward minimal standards. Corporations play nations against each other, threatening to relocate if regulations or taxes increase. National governments lose capacity to regulate capital that can simply move elsewhere. This creates the global working class Marx envisioned. A Chinese factory worker, a Mexican agricultural laborer, a Bangladeshi garment worker, and an American service worker share common position relative to global capital. They compete with each other for jobs and wages, but their interests align against capital. International solidarity becomes both necessary and difficult. Language, culture, and distance separate workers. Yet capital's global operation requires global resistance. Immigration becomes flashpoint as capital creates conditions driving migration, while workers in receiving countries blame migrants for job losses and wage pressure. This divides the working class along national and racial lines exactly as Marx warned. Capital benefits from these divisions, which prevent unified resistance. Overcoming them requires recognizing common interests and building international solidarity. The old Marxist vision in new circumstances. The digital economy creates new questions for Marxist analysis. Do tech companies like Google and Facebook exploit users differently than traditional capitalists exploit workers? Users generate data that companies monetize, but users are not paid. Is this a new form of unpaid labor, or are users voluntarily participating in exchanges that happen to generate profits? The question matters for understanding contemporary capitalism and identifying points of resistance. Platform companies like Uber and Airbnb claim to be technology companies, not transportation or hospitality companies. This allows them to avoid regulations and responsibilities. But Marxist analysis suggests they are primarily extracting surplus value from workers who own vehicles or apartments. The technology is merely the mechanism. The fundamental relationship is exploitation of labor, not provision of neutral platform. Understanding this clarifies struggles over worker classification and regulation. The financialization of capitalism also poses questions. Finance has grown enormously relative to production. Profits increasingly come from financial speculation rather than producing goods. Does this represent a fundamental shift in capitalism's nature? Or is it manifestation of deeper problems, particularly falling profit rates in production driving capital toward speculation? Marx's framework suggests the latter. Finance is parasitic on production, and its growth reflects productive capitalism's difficulties. Contemporary political developments confirm Marx's analysis of the state. Governments claim to be neutral arbiters actually serve capital consistently. Austerity policies cut social spending while protecting bank profits. Tax systems favor the wealthy. Regulations are weakened or unenforced. Bailouts rescue financial institutions while workers face unemployment. The state functions as Marx described, managing conflicts within the ruling class and suppressing challenges from below while maintaining conditions for accumulation. Yet political possibilities also emerge. Socialist ideas gain traction, particularly among young people facing dim economic prospects. Democratic socialist candidates win elections. Movements demand universal health care, housing as a right, Green New Deal. Labor organizing increases after decades of decline. These developments show capitalism's failures generate resistance, though whether resistance becomes revolutionary transformation remains uncertain. The authoritarian turn in many countries reflects capitalism's crisis. When economic promises fail, ruling classes resort to nationalism, racism, scapegoating. Strongman leaders claim to protect national workers while serving capital. This is not fascism necessarily, but shares its dynamics. Popular mobilization against elites combined with attacks on vulnerable groups and preservation of capitalist fundamentals. Marx would recognize this as ruling class response to crisis. Technology companies wield unprecedented power, raising questions about whether they constitute a new ruling class. Tech billionaires are certainly capitalists, but do they represent something qualitatively different? Their wealth comes partly from intellectual property, control of platforms, network effects rather than traditional ownership of means of production. Yet fundamentally, they exploit labor, extract surplus value, accumulate capital. They are capitalists in new forms, not a new class entirely. The surveillance state grows through combination of government and corporate power. Intelligence agencies collect massive data. Corporations track behavior for profit. The boundary blurs as they share information. This total surveillance would have horrified Marx, who valued privacy and freedom. It represents new mechanisms of control but serves old functions, maintaining existing order, suppressing resistance, protecting property and profit. Mental health crises, addiction, alienation, plague contemporary society at epidemic levels. Rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide increase despite or because of material prosperity. Marx would see this as alienation in psychological form. When work is meaningless, community is absent, and life revolves around consumption, people suffer existentially. Therapy and medication treat symptoms without addressing social causes. The problem is capitalism's reduction of human life to commodity relations. Some argue that Marx is outdated, that knowledge work and service economy differ fundamentally from industrial capitalism he analyzed. But service workers are exploited through surplus value extraction like factory workers. Knowledge workers sell labor power like manual workers. The forms differ, but the relationship persists. Others claim abundance has replaced scarcity, making Marx's focus on production irrelevant. But billions remain impoverished, and artificial scarcity maintains profit where abundance threatens it. The claim that everyone can become capitalists through stock ownership ignores that most people own negligible stock, and ownership without control is not capital in Marx's sense. Small retirement accounts do not make workers into capitalists any more than small savings make them bankers. The fundamental division between those who must sell labor power and those who live from capital remains despite attempts to obscure it. Perhaps Marx's most relevant insight is that capitalism is not eternal or natural, but historical and changeable. The system emerged from specific conditions and can be transformed. Current arrangements are not inevitable, but serve particular interests. Alternatives are possible. This is simultaneously analytical claim and political commitment. Understanding capitalism's contradictions reveals possibilities for transcending it. Whether such transcendence occurs depends on political action. Marx's analysis shows objective tendencies and contradictions but does not guarantee outcomes. Capitalism can persist through crises indefinitely if no alternative is built. It can become increasingly authoritarian and destructive if unchallenged. Or it can be transformed through organized working-class struggle into something better. The future is open, determined by human action within structural constraints. Modern Marxists debate whether reform or revolution remains relevant. Some argue democratic socialism can achieve necessary transformation through electoral means and gradual reforms. Others insist capitalism's structural dynamics require revolutionary rupture. Still others seek synthesis, reforms as preparation for revolution, building power and consciousness through struggles for immediate improvements. These debates echo throughout socialist history. What seems clear is that Marx's analysis retains explanatory power. Inequality, crisis, alienation, exploitation, ecological destruction, all follow from capitalism's logic as he described it. His vision of cooperative, democratic, sustainable society, organized to meet human needs rather than accumulate profit, remains compelling. Whether achieving this vision is possible and through what means continues to challenge those seeking alternatives to capitalism. Marx in the 21st century is not dead prophet but living critical tradition. His methods and insights guide analysis of contemporary capitalism. His commitment to working class self-emancipation inspires movements for justice. His vision of a better world motivates struggles against exploitation and oppression. The specific predictions may have failed, but the fundamental critique and revolutionary project remain vital. As long as capitalism persists with its contradictions and injustices, Marx's work will retain relevance, providing tools for understanding and inspiration for transforming a world where human potential is sacrificed to capital accumulation. The eternal debate: capitalism versus socialism today. The contest between capitalism and socialism, declared finished after the Soviet Union's collapse, has returned with renewed intensity. Young people embrace socialist ideas at rates unseen in generations. Democratic socialists win elections. Polls show majorities, especially among the young, view capitalism negatively and socialism positively. Yet capitalism remains globally dominant, its defenders insisting no viable alternative exists. The eternal debate continues with higher stakes than ever. Climate crisis, extreme inequality, and technological transformation make the choice between systems increasingly urgent. Capitalism's defenders point to its achievements. It has generated unprecedented material abundance. Global poverty has declined dramatically, particularly in China and India. Life expectancy has increased. Technology has advanced spectacularly. Consumer goods unimaginable decades ago are now commonplace. The market coordinates billions of decisions efficiently. Innovation flourishes. Individual freedom is protected. Compared to socialist experiments that produce scarcity and tyranny, capitalism delivers prosperity and liberty. This defense contains truth but omits much. Poverty reduction occurred primarily in China, hardly a free market economy, but rather state-directed development. Absolute poverty declined while inequality soared. The abundance is grotesquely maldistributed, with obscene luxury alongside desperate need. Technological advance concentrates wealth and displaces workers. Consumer goods are often trivial, while basic needs go unmet. Market efficiency means efficient exploitation. Innovation serves profit, not human welfare. Freedom means freedom to sell labor or starve. Moreover, capitalism's successes rest on exploitation and destruction that may prove unsustainable. Growth depended on colonialism, slavery, and imperial extraction from the global south. Current prosperity relies on ecological destruction threatening civilization itself. Financial crises periodically wipe out accumulated wealth. The system's dynamism produces constant disruption and insecurity. What appears as achievement from one angle looks like catastrophe from another. Socialists argue that capitalism's contradictions are intensifying toward crisis. Inequality reaches levels incompatible with social stability. Automation threatens mass unemployment. Climate change accelerates toward irreversible tipping points. Financial speculation creates fragility. Democracy erodes as wealth translates directly into political power. These problems are not accidents or policy failures, but systemic features requiring systemic transformation. The socialist alternative emphasizes social ownership, democratic planning, production for need rather than profit. Instead of capitalists controlling production, workers would manage enterprises democratically. Instead of market anarchy, conscious planning would coordinate economic activity. Instead of growth imperative, sustainable development would respect ecological limits. Instead of competition, cooperation would organize social life. Resources would serve human needs rather than capital accumulation. Capitalism's defenders respond that socialism has been tried and failed catastrophically. The Soviet Union produced sclerotic economy, political tyranny, environmental devastation. China achieved growth only by embracing markets. Cuba remains impoverished despite revolution. Venezuela's crisis shows socialist policies produced disaster. Every attempt at socialism led to dictatorship and decline. This historical record cannot be ignored or explained away. Capitalism's flaws are preferable to socialism's failures. Socialists have several responses. First, many purported socialist states were actually state capitalist, with bureaucracy exploiting workers rather than collective democratic control. Second, socialist experiments faced hostile international environments, sanctions, sabotage, making fair evaluation impossible. Third, failures reflected specific historical circumstances, not inherent problems with social ownership and planning. Fourth, capitalism's own horrific record, from slavery through colonialism to world wars and Holocaust, does not disqualify it in defenders' eyes. So why should socialism be held to different standard? The debate involves fundamentally different value frameworks. Capitalists prioritize individual freedom, particularly freedom to own property and engage in market exchange. They view inequality as acceptable if it reflects different choices and talents. They trust markets to allocate resources better than planners. They believe competition drives innovation and efficiency. They see private property as essential to liberty. Socialists prioritize collective welfare and equality. They view freedom under capitalism as largely formal, meaningless without material basis. They see inequality as unjust and destabilizing regardless of its origins. They believe democratic planning can serve human needs better than profit-seeking. They view cooperation as more humane and efficient than competition. They see private property and means of production as enabling exploitation and blocking genuine freedom. These different values lead to different assessments of trade-offs. Capitalists accept inequality for growth, insecurity for dynamism, environmental damage for prosperity. Socialists accept reduced consumption of luxuries for equality, regulated efficiency for democratic control, slower change for stability. Neither side can prove their values objectively superior. The choice involves moral and political judgment as much as economic analysis. Contemporary developments complicate the debate. Mixed economies combining capitalist markets with extensive state intervention and social provision characterize most developed countries. Social democracies in Scandinavia achieve low inequality, high living standards, extensive welfare, yet remain fundamentally capitalist. Does this show capitalism can be humanized, or that even extensive reforms cannot transcend exploitation and crisis tendencies? Socialists note that social democratic achievements are under attack. Austerity erodes welfare states. Neoliberal policies privatize public goods. Globalization undermines national regulation. Even Scandinavian countries face pressure to reduce benefits and deregulate. This suggests that reforms within capitalism are always vulnerable, that capitalist logic ultimately reasserts itself against redistributive policies. Only transcending capitalism can secure and extend social democratic gains. Capitalists respond that social democracy proves markets and private property are compatible with equity and welfare. Problems come from bad policies, not system fundamentals. Better regulation, progressive taxation, and social investment can address inequality and insecurity without abolishing markets. Innovation in public policy can solve problems without revolutionary transformation. Pragmatic reform beats utopian revolution. The ecological crisis sharpens the debate decisively. Capitalism requires endless growth to function. Profit comes from accumulation. Competition forces expansion. But endless growth on a finite planet is impossible. Climate change, resource depletion, ecosystem collapse result from growth imperative. Can capitalism become sustainable, or does sustainability require transcending capitalism? Green capitalism advocates carbon pricing, renewable energy investment, circular economy. Markets can internalize environmental costs and drive green innovation. Sustainable capitalism is possible through proper incentives and regulations. This allows addressing climate change without abandoning market economy. Eco-socialists argue this is fantasy. Profit imperatives trump environmental concerns consistently. Corporations resist meaningful regulation. Greenwashing substitutes for real change. Technological solutions serve accumulation, not sustainability. Carbon markets create new financial instruments without reducing emissions. Real solutions require degrowth, reduced consumption in global north, democratic control of production, prioritizing sustainability over profit. Only socialism can achieve this. Technology adds another dimension. Automation could liberate humans from drudgery or create mass unemployment, depending on who controls it. Artificial intelligence could democratize knowledge or concentrate power. Platforms could enable cooperation or intensify exploitation. Under capitalism, technology serves capital accumulation, displacing workers and concentrating wealth. Under socialism, it could reduce labor time and spread benefits widely. Universal basic income is proposed as solution to automation under capitalism. Give everyone unconditional income to maintain consumption as jobs disappear. This might address immediate crisis, but leaves production under capitalist control. Workers become dependent on transfers funded by capitalist profits, reinforcing rather than challenging power relations. Socialists argue for workers controlling automated production directly rather than receiving handouts from robot-owning capitalists. The political question is whether capitalism can be reformed sufficiently or must be replaced. Social Democrats believe progressive policies within capitalism can achieve adequate justice and sustainability. Revolutionary socialists argue capitalism's structural logic makes this impossible. Reforms help but cannot transcend exploitation, inequality, crisis, and ecological destruction. Only systemic transformation establishes genuine democracy and sustainability. This debate cannot be resolved theoretically, but only through political struggle and historical experience. Neither side can prove their case definitively. Evidence is contested, values differ, predictions are uncertain. What works depends on circumstances, organization, consciousness, unpredictable events. What seems clear is that business as usual leads toward catastrophe. Climate change alone makes continuation of current path untenable. Whether the alternative is reformed capitalism or democratic socialism or something else entirely remains to be determined. But transformation of some kind is necessary. The choice is not between perfect socialism and imperfect capitalism, but between different imperfect systems with different problems and possibilities. Capitalism offers proven ability to generate growth but produces inequality, instability, and ecological destruction. Socialism offers vision of equality and sustainability but faces enormous challenges in implementation and risks of authoritarianism. Perhaps the real question is not whether to replace capitalism, but how to create economic democracy. How can ordinary people control economic decisions affecting their lives? How can production serve human needs and ecological sustainability rather than profit? How can technology benefit everyone rather than concentrating wealth? These questions transcend capitalism versus socialism labels while addressing core issues both traditions engage. Worker cooperatives, community ownership, participatory budgeting, democratic planning experiments all represent attempts to increase economic democracy. They exist within capitalism but point toward alternatives. Expanding and linking such initiatives could create transformative potential. This might be reform or revolution depending on extent and pace of change. The eternal debate ultimately concerns human possibility. Can we consciously organize society to serve collective welfare? Or do we require market discipline and private property to function? Are humans capable of cooperation and democratic self-governance? Or do we need competition and hierarchy? These questions have no final answers but must be confronted continually through political practice. Marx's contribution was insisting these questions are not about human nature but about social organization. Capitalism is historical, not eternal. It emerged from specific conditions and can be transcended. Alternatives are possible. Whether they will be realized depends on political struggle, not theoretical arguments. The debate between capitalism and socialism is ultimately a debate about what kind of world we want to build and whether we have the collective capacity to build it. The answer will be determined not by arguments, but by movements, organizations, and ultimately by whether people choose to fight for a different world or accept the one capital creates. The debate continues because the stakes could not be higher: the future of humanity and the planet itself.